Hey folks, welcome. Glad to be here with all of you tonight. We're going to have yet another great late night chat. Glad that you're all here. Let's jump into it.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. We're just having yet another great late night chat. We're going to talk about an interesting topic. I've prepared a slideshow on tonight, which I think it'll be a good conversation that we have tonight. But I'm going to talk about a few other things too. But as usual, we'll be following our normal format, which is first I give my opening remarks, and then from there we do the roll call where I call you all out as I see you, names and locations. We find out who is on the other side of the camera, who's watching, and then after that I answer your questions for the remainder of the night. So if there's something you would like me to talk about in the second half of the show, if there's something on your mind, if something I say arises a question, all you need to do is go to buymeacoffee.com/Caleb Maupin and send in your question. Or you can do a super chat on YouTube. We are monetized. That works as well. You can do a Rumble rant. We already have Buy Me a Coffee works anytime, by the way. We already have one. It was sent by John. So that'll be the first one answered. He asked my opinion about something. And so, yeah, the second half of the show is all you guys. I'll answer your questions and engage with you guys about whatever's on your mind. So yeah, that's how these things tend to work. Now, in terms of announcements, the Center for Political Innovation is the organization that we're building here. We are an optimistic, anti-imperialist movement. We want an America with a government of action that fights for working families, a new America beyond imperialism. We're having our national training school in Chicago in August. It's going to be really, really great, and it's filling up. People are registering, so please go and register if you plan to attend. If you're already a CPI member and you want to become accredited, please go ahead. If you've already attended and you want to come again this year, great. If you are interested in learning more about CPI, it's going to be a really, really great 7 days in Chicago in August 12th through 19th. The registration link is in the chat. Let me put it on the Rumble here. You can just register to attend our national training program, August 12th through 19th. It's going to be a lot of fun. Also, during that program, we're going to be having a rally for France out of Africa. That's going to be really, really awesome. So I hope that you will join us for that. It's going to be tremendous, and it's going to be a really great time in Chicago. The Center for Political Innovation, we are an organization that gives off an optimistic vibe. We want to bring people together. We want to talk about what America could be beyond the rule of Wall Street and profits beyond war. We're the Center for Political Innovation. This is us. That's us. We are the Center for Political Innovation, and we are organizing, and we have got great stuff. People are joining the organization around the country. A couple new memberships came in last week. I'm very excited about it. We got new members in the New York City area who we're going to be meeting with, and I mean, great things are happening. So if you want to get involved in anti-imperialism and building a new America for working families, join the Center for Political Innovation. CPI. We are the organization that is doing it. Dare to struggle, dare to win. Nobody does it like CPI does it. So that's us. So yes, just a reminder, as I said before, we're going to follow our normal format tonight, which is first the opening remarks, then the roll call, and then I answer your questions. So if you've got a question for me to answer tonight, go to buymeacoffee.com/Caleb Maupin and send your question. You can also do super chats. You can also do Rumble rants on the Rumble. So yeah, that's how we do it. So I'm just going to jump into a couple things tonight. I did want to mention I was in the streets reporting on the truce with Iran, the Memorandum of Understanding, which seems to be holding, which looks like a pretty solid victory for Iran. Iran has faced a brutal onslaught. Their supreme leader was murdered. They were bombed and attacked, but it seems like they've effectively retaliated. The United States did not feel comfortable going in and clearing the Strait of Hormuz because the cost would have been too high. And as a result, now the Strait of Hormuz is open, and the USA has ended its barricade of Iranian ports, and the peace deal is holding. Israel seems to be very angry about this peace deal, which seems to indicate that this peace deal is something that Iran is very much a beneficiary of. Israel doesn't like it when Iran is gaining. Israel sees Iran as its main regional opponent, and Israel is really mad about this deal. So I guess I reported on this afternoon. I will say it was a little bit difficult. I was out in the hot sun. I had bright lights in my face, and the wind was blowing on me like crazy. I was by the river. But this is my reporting from this afternoon on the truce with Iran. On RT. It's been going every hour or so. So I'll just show you that. And then we'll get into the main topic for tonight. So here we go.
De-escalation deal with Iran to stop the war and pave the way for peace talks.
The United States is committed to peace, and we encourage everyone in the Middle East region to maintain their commitment to allowing our negotiations to beautifully unfold. The markets are loving what is happening with oil prices way down and stocks way up. We expect a complete ceasefire on all fronts, including Lebanon, Hezbollah and Israel. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
Well, the ceasefire calls for a cessation of all hostilities, no more conflict, no more attacks between U.S. forces and Iranian forces, as well as an end to the conflict in Lebanon. Israel, which is currently engaged in operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah, they've got to stop, according to the deal. And Israelis are not happy about that. We've heard many Israeli voices denouncing this deal, saying that it is a betrayal of Israel, saying that it is too much of a gift and too much of a support for the Islamic Republic. And J.D. Vance, the vice president, has been speaking up, saying he's not thrilled with the criticisms of this deal coming from Israel, and that Israel's denunciation of this deal and efforts to hinder an effort to bring the conflict to an end, moving to keep the hostilities going, are not appreciated by the White House. This is J.D. Vance.
You've seen people in their system, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who've attacked the deal. And I guess my response to them would be, what is your exact proposal? And, you're a country of 9 million people. You can't just kill your way out of solving every single national security problem that you have.
Now, he also specifically criticized Israel's attacks on Beirut, saying they were absolutely unnecessary. And while the White House does understand Israel does need to, as he put it, defend itself against Hezbollah, that the attacks really went too far and seemed to be an effort to hinder the peace process and bringing a conflict to an end. Here's what J.D. Vance said regarding Israel's attacks on Beirut.
The Israelis, just like everybody else, have to respect this peace process that is fundamentally good for them and good for the entire region. What the president has grown frustrated sometimes is that we seem to be right on the cusp of a major breakthrough in the agreement, and then all of a sudden there's a major explosion that goes off in a civilian population center in Beirut, and a lot of people who have nothing to do with Hezbollah lose their lives. That's not acceptable. That's the sort of thing that we've asked for closer coordination so that we ensure it doesn't happen.
Now, J.D. Vance also went on to point out that 2/3 of Israel's military hardware and weaponry were provided by the United States, and that to call Donald Trump not a friend of Israel, or to say that Donald Trump is somehow selling out Israel, is pretty absurd when Donald Trump has been solidly behind Israel throughout the conflict and backing them, supporting them, and attacking Iran. And that the fact that this statement is being made is causing the White House to be quite unhappy. The patience of the administration for Israel in light of these criticisms and what it views as almost efforts to undermine negotiations with Iran, the patience of the White House is running out.
What about the Iranian side? What sort of statements are we hearing from that side?
Now, the new supreme leader of Iran gave his long-awaited statement regarding the Memorandum of Understanding. This is the son of Supreme Leader Ali Syed Khamenei, who was murdered on February 28th at the start of this conflict. Now, his son came forward and gave his statement saying that while he does not agree and has a differing opinion with some of the forces that negotiated the deal, he will allow the Memorandum of Understanding to proceed. This is what was said by the Supreme Leader of Iran in the aftermath of the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding.
As a matter of principle, I held a different view. However, due to the commitment that the respected president, as the head of the Supreme National Security Council, gave to me on behalf of himself and other members regarding the safeguarding of the rights of the Iranian nation and the axis of resistance, and his explicit acceptance of responsibility for it, I issued my permission for it. He has also explicitly stated that if the American side seeks to make excessive demands, they will not submit to them.
Now, J.D. Vance has confirmed at this point that the U.S. maritime blockade of Iranian ports has been lifted, and Iran is able to import products. Ships are able to dock in Iranian harbors. In addition to that, it appears that funds belonging to Iran that have been frozen around the world in banks are being released, and Iran will get those funds. And in addition to that, oil exceptions and the ability of Iran to export oil in light of U.S. sanctions is being approved. The U.S. government is granting exceptions to the sanctions. At this point, commercial vessels seem to be proceeding through the Strait of Hormuz without a fee, and that has been confirmed by Iranian officials. So at this point, a lot of things seem to be moving ahead. The United States and Iran don't seem to be in conflict as they were. Now, one question that remains is the issue of rebuilding Iran. There's talk of $300 billion going to Iran for reconstruction. Now, who will provide those funds? According to some reports, it's supposed to come directly from the United States, but J.D. Vance has indicated that would be coming from the U.S.'s Gulf state allies. Here's J.D. Vance commenting on Iranian reconstruction.
There is a great desire from the Arab world and from outside the Arab world to actually get involved in Iran if they behave properly.
Now, an important point in the deal is that the status quo regarding Iran's peaceful nuclear energy program will proceed. Iran has agreed and re-emphasized its commitment not to cultivate or develop nuclear weapons, and that Iran will not be expanding its uranium enrichment. The peaceful nuclear energy program will exist as it is currently intact. It will not be expanding. In addition to that, it is important to note that at this point we have a lot of opposition to the deal coming from voices in the United States. U.S. Senator Chris Murphy has gone on the record denouncing this deal, calling it a betrayal, saying that it is a gift to the Islamic Republic, that it gives legitimacy and credibility to the Islamic Republic, it is an affront to Israel, etc. Meanwhile, we have Tucker Carlson, a voice who was campaigning for Donald Trump during the 2024 elections, a popular television host who supported Trump but then broke with him over his attack on Iran and his continued support for Israel. Tucker Carlson speaking up and saying that at this point Iran cannot be called a rogue state, and that this conflict has granted a new level of legitimacy to Iran as a world power. This is Tucker Carlson.
This document is acknowledging that Iran is not a rogue terror state. Iran is a sovereign nation, in fact, a great power, because it's negotiating with the world's greatest power, the United States. And the United States is acknowledging that, hey, you have a right to run your country as you like.
So at this point, we've got the Strait of Hormuz with ships going through it without fees. We've got Iranian oil going onto the market due to exceptions being granted in U.S. sanctions. We've got Iranian funds being unfrozen. And it appears the conflict between the United States and Iran is not proceeding. This conflict seems to be over. Now, there's a lot of loud opposition to the Memorandum of Understanding from Israel. The White House is calling it a victory for the United States. Iran is calling it a victory for the Islamic Republic, and regardless of how different forces feel, it appears this truce is holding. Now that we've heard from Iran's supreme leader, the new supreme leader, who has said that despite his differing opinion, he is allowing this memorandum of understanding and agreement to proceed.
The next is 6.
So there we go. That seems to be the situation. Yeah, I mean, we can only hope that the war is over, that sanctions on Iran will be lifted. I mean, that Iran gets some of that reconstruction money that's been promised. We look at the situation, and this war has been an absolute disaster for the global economy. This war has been a disaster in so many ways, completely unprovoked. I mean, they just out of the blue murdered the supreme leader, bombed Iran. There was no changes in their peaceful nuclear energy program. There was no provocation or threat from Iran. I mean, this was a completely unprovoked situation. This was just a favor to Israel. And I hope the conflict is over, and I hope Iran can get some sanctions relief, and we shall see. We shall see. I guess the next 30 days are going to be crucial. The next 60 days are going to be crucial. There's some final negotiations, and there's that money that's been promised, and there's a lot up in the air, but at least for the moment it appears they won't be shooting at each other. That the Strait of Hormuz will be opened, and we in CPI, we've been out in the streets standing with Iran, saying hands off Iran. We blocked the No Kings protest in New York City. We had a national day of action on February 28th, which ended up being the day the war ended up breaking out. We have done a lot to support Iran. I have a whole history with Iran. I have a documentary film. If you go to the CPI website, you can watch a documentary film that I made in Iran in 2015 that was shown on Iranian television. So we have paid close attention to this. CPI, we published this book about the Houthis. Who are the Houthis and what are they fighting for? Kind of an informational little booklet we distributed in bulk across the country about Ansar Allah, the organization in Yemen that is aligned with Iran. So keep that all in mind. But tonight, I wanted to do a presentation about something that's been on my mind for a while. It's very interesting. But basically, this is what the presentation is about. I travel a lot for my job. Last year, I was in Los Angeles a bit. And while I was in Los Angeles, I noticed that there was a local group of teenage Maoists. I think they're called, Dare to Struggle Los Angeles, something like that. I noticed when I was in Minneapolis that there's a couple teenage high school, college-age Maoists. I noticed here in New York City on October 7th, I covered a little protest by a group of Maoists. And this seems to be a new trend, right? In addition to, the various communist groups that have been around, a lot of them are getting a lot smaller in recent decades. But in addition to that, in addition to the Democratic Socialists of America, in addition to the PSL and the different groups that are out there, there's a trend of the local teenage Maoist club. So I have done kind of a deep dive into this trend because it seems like wherever you go, I mean, there's one in Norfolk, Virginia. There was a group in Austin, Texas, the Red Guards of Austin for a while. There's multiple groups in New York City. And it just seems every corner of this country, every major city, you have a little club of 10 to 15, 20, 15 to 30-year-olds, basically. And they have their own little Maoist communist group. What's this about? Where did this trend come from? So that's my PowerPoint, my slideshow for tonight. The local teenage Maoist club. Everything you need to know. So let's dig into it. In the 2020s, the leftist scene in almost every major city has a local teenage Maoist club. You had the Red Guards of Austin. You had Dare to Struggle Los Angeles. In New York City, you had Behind Enemy Lines. You had the Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee that's now defunct. There's a group in Virginia. There's groups in Atlanta, Georgia. Basically, the groups tend to be 10 to 20 people, and at the most, often 5 to 10. They tend to have a small website and a small social media presence. They tend to be hostile to the larger communist groups, and they utilize rhetoric about people's war, communism, and guns. This is basically any major city you go to. There will be one of these little groups that will spring up, and often there's 2 or 3 of them. I know there's 2 or 3 of them at least in New York City. One of the groups, they had a pro-Palestine rally on October 7th where they gathered in New York City on 42nd Street, and they burned an American flag, and the NYPD arrested 2 of them, and they screamed and yelled at the NYPD. And I was there with the camera crew. This was on October 7th. This group that's called Behind Enemy Lines, they all had their faces covered up. They burned an American flag to support the Palestinians, and a couple of them got arrested, and they chanted against the police. This was the incident on October 7th, 2025 that I covered.
We're here in front of the Israeli consulate. So these people are sick, and they've been starving Gaza and throwing out aid, and these are the conditions that you harass, brutalize, and oppress people every day in New York City. Get the fuck out of here, bitch. Don't touch her. Don't fucking touch her. Hands off her. Don't fucking touch people, son. Get your hands off. Get your hands off. One more time, let go.
Let go of her. Why are you guys doing this? You don't need to do this.
Do not obstruct the rest. Stop obstructing. Let go. Hands off. Get your hands off. Get your hands off. Fuck you.
Yo, don't twist me off. Don't twist me fucking off. Right to rebel.
Now, the
Nazi sympathize.
You know, it was like 10 or 15 kids, basically. They started out in the Bronx, and then they went into Manhattan, and they lit an American flag on fire, and a couple of them got arrested, and they all had their faces covered up, and they yelled a lot of profanity. They used an old Weather Underground slogan, "Bring the war home," which is a 1960s, Weather Underground SDS slogan. But there weren't that many of them. It was a small group, but they clearly were Maoist communists, and they were using, dare to struggle, dare to win, it is right to rebel, bring the war home, modeling themselves on the 1970s Maoist communist thing. It exists. And when I was in LA, I saw this at the anti-ICE protests. And when I was in Minneapolis, I saw this at the anti-ICE protests. And, when I was in Austin, Texas, I saw graffiti from the Red Guards of Austin. I guess they're defunct, but, there was a Red Guards club in Austin for a while. And, this is just part of the political scene. It used to be years ago, there were certain communist groups you'd see everywhere. A lot of those groups aren't around anymore, but some of them still are. But now this is just part of the radical scene in America. As you will see a little teenage Maoist club in every major city. Usually there's, in some cases, there's 2 or 3. And so where do these groups come from? What are the roots of this kind of politics? All right. Well, I have written a lot about the new communist movement of the 1970s, and that's a whole different thing. And I've written this book, and I've given PowerPoints on here many times about the NCM, the new communist movement. I think the new communist movement of the 1970s is worth studying. That's a totally different thing. That was a layer of people in America in the 1970s who tried to form a new communist party that was aligned with China. They were inspired by China, inspired by Mao. They wanted to form a new communist party. I've written a lot about this. I have a lot of PowerPoints already on this channel, and I have a whole book you can get about that. But after the new communist movement, as the new communist movement started to decline in the late 70s, with the death of Mao Zedong, with the rise of Ronald Reagan, the rise of Deng Xiaoping in China, there was a lot of confusion, and communist politics in America started to really deteriorate. It had been very popular throughout the 1970s, but in the late 70s, early 80s, communist groups in America all started to really decline. One of the groups that was probably the biggest communist group during the 1970s among the Maoist communists was called the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP. The leader of the RCP was a guy named Bob Avakian. And Bob Avakian, he decided that Deng Xiaoping was a traitor to Mao's legacy, had betrayed communism. And so he led a protest against Deng Xiaoping at the White House. When Deng Xiaoping came to the White House and the USA established diplomatic relations with China in 1979, he led a death to Deng Xiaoping rally. The group, then started calling, it said that there were no communist countries in the world, that China had sold out, and all the other communist countries were revisionist. And the RCP, they changed a lot during those years. And their leader, Bob Avakian, eventually went into exile and fled the country and set up shop in France, where he did apply for political exile status. And the RCP suddenly, after they broke with China and after they decided there were no legitimate communist countries in the world, they changed their approach. They had kind of an approach of out of the movement to the masses, trying to go to the masses of people. There was the whole story with their busing thing and with their protest in 1976. They completely reversed all of that. And they became kind of what you might call an ultra-leftist organization. They declared that only the quote-unquote lumpen proletariat, the poorest of the poor, had revolutionary potential, that most American workers were what they called bourgeoisified. And they started focusing on counterculture youth. I guess Bob Avakian went to a Jimmy Buffett concert, and he observed how the young people at the Jimmy Buffett concert, who were often middle class, were smoking marijuana, and that made them rebellious. He thought that youth rebellion was more revolutionary than the working class in general, and they needed to stop trying to appeal to the bulk of the population and focus on counterculture youth. And so, you had the RCP as a political group. They were the big China-aligned communist group. They broke with China. They started organizing, focusing on counterculture youth and saying that only the lumpen proletariat, the poorest of the poor, the black urban working class, only they had revolutionary potential. And they kind of became the face of communism in America. They had a chain of bookstores called Revolution Books that had big pictures of Mao and Stalin in the window. And they marched around with hammers and sickles and red flags, and they were the visible communist group. The Communist Party USA functioned in a kind of clandestine manner. I mean, they might have a bookstore here or there, but they were generally kind of organizing secretly and trying to get Democrats elected. You had various Trotskyite groups that existed and went out and sold their newspaper and stuff. But the RCP they waved red flags, they waved Mao's little red book, and they were in your face. They were communists, and they had cut off all ties to any communist governments. And this is they made a film in 1987 called, to promote themselves. It's just kind of a little like VHS video that they circulated. And this is from that film.
We know that you won't sell out and revolution won't be betrayed, either before it even happens or after it, when you just try to turn it into your own thing for your own benefit. Well, I'll say this first of all. I myself, speaking for myself personally, have been fighting this system politically for 15 years. I've been a revolutionary for 12 and a conscious communist for 10 or more, and I got no intention of being or doing anything else as long as I'm alive and for as long as I can contribute to the struggle, and they're going to have to kill me to stop me from doing that, and we're going to fight to see that that doesn't happen either. It's not just a question that we have revolutionary determination. We've fought to get to the point where we are, to develop the revolutionary line that we have, to have the grasp and application of the revolutionary theory that we have. And there's going to be many sharp struggles to safeguard, to protect, defend that, and to apply and enrich and deepen in the process of leading not just thousands, but ultimately millions of people. And finally, I put it back to you.
Yeah, and these are images from their every year on May 1st, they would call like a national strike. That wasn't a national strike. It was just they would have little rallies with big hammers and sickles and red flags. And, in major cities, and their members would get arrested and get beaten up. And and they sold their newspaper, and they were kind of the face of communism in America. And one thing that they made a point of doing was burning the American flag. That was a big thing, and I'll get back to that. But anyhow, a number of these parties that had been aligned with China, they met in Britain, and they formed something called the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement. And they denounced China. They announced that they were Marxist, Leninist, Maoists, MLM, right? China does not talk about Maoism, right? In China, they say that they have a Marxist, Leninist ideology. They practice Mao Zedong thought, and then they have Deng Xiaoping theory. Well, they declared, we don't believe in Mao Zedong thought anymore. We are Marxist, Leninist, Maoists. And there was, there's a group in Peru, the Shining Path, which is a very nasty kind of extremist group that gained a lot of power in the 80s and 90s. They also took that position. They bombed the Chinese embassy. They bombed the Cuban embassy because they had sold out the revolution. They were a Peruvian, extremist group. There is, in Nepal, there's groups in Nepal that, that now are part of the government, but were waging an armed civil war in Nepal. There's groups in India, the Naxalites, they were called, that were waging kind of an armed civil war in the countryside. And the RCP and the Naxalites and the Shining Path in Peru, the Naxalites in India, Prachanda Path in Nepal, they all signed that they were Marxist, Leninist, Maoists, that, all the communist countries had sold out. They were against Deng Xiaoping. They were against China. And they were, holding on to the line of the Gang of Four, which were the people that had, been running China in the final years of Mao's life. And that was this political current. And you could say probably the country where they had the most influence was Peru. And Peru in the 1980s, and especially in the 1990s, there was an insurgency by the Shining Path. They gained a lot of influence among rural people, indigenous folks in Peru, and there was a bloody civil war, and a lot of people died. I mean, it was a pretty ugly civil war in Peru in the 1990s, and the RCP was the American communist group that was aligned with them. And they kind of distinguished themselves after they had kind of denounced the bulk of the American population as bourgeoisified and bought off. They decided, based on their leader having this revelation at a Jimmy Buffett concert, that, it was counterculture youth were the revolutionary edge, and that only the most impoverished, masses, the urban black masses and very poor people, only they were revolutionary, that most American workers were bourgeoisified, and that they wanted to recruit counterculture youth. They made a big point of burning the American flag. And in fact, they took it to the U.S. Supreme Court. Gregory Johnson, who went by Joey Johnson, got arrested for burning a flag at the 1984 Republican National Convention in Dallas, Texas. And so he took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that you do have the right to burn a flag. It is now legal to burn the American flag thanks to the Revolutionary Communist Party. And this is actually Connie Chung interviewing on, I forget, was it 2020 or Countdown or one of these, Dateline, or I forget which, it's one of these like news magazines. This is Connie Chung, kind of a famous reporter, interviewing Joey Johnson about why he decided to burn an American flag and go to jail and take it all the way to the Supreme Court. It's kind of amusing, kind of gives you a flavor for the kind of politics these people were espousing in the 80s and 90s, right? After they had cut their ties with China, after they had just decided that they were going to kind of engage in this kind of counterculture, punk rock, communist politics.
Listen to your message, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, but that ought to raise another question. Like, why is it that people are trained to have this emotional, like, knee-jerk reaction, to the burning of a piece of cloth?
It's the symbol of our country.
Yeah, but that's the point. The content of the symbolism is what's being disputed and debated. Maybe I offend Jim and Tammy Baker, like, so what? I don't care. Maybe I offend some people need to be offended. Anarchy! There was an encampment down by a toxic river that flows through downtown Dallas. And we had meetings in the encampment to well, what are we going to do? Because the atmosphere was very repressive. There was like wall-to-wall police. They were just busting people for jaywalking. They said jaywalking was the first step towards anarchy. We went through the financial district of downtown Dallas, and we had what we call die-ins, simulating the effects of a nuclear attack, and everybody would like count down 10, 9, 8, and to disrupt the business as usual atmosphere of these corporations.
Would you agree that people think that you're some crazy wacko?
Not all people. You know, I think a lot of people are very politically challenged and stuff, and excited to see that there's people out here resisting against the system.
Are you dangerous? Are you dangerous?
I think to the powers that be.
Are you a communist?
Yeah, revolutionary communist.
Let's fight the power!
It was revolution that 13 years ago led Johnson to join a little-known group called the Revolutionary Communist Youth Brigade. But the protester with no permanent address, the man who battled the courts for the right to symbolic free speech, is reluctant to talk about one thing, himself. How do you live?
We talked about that already.
No, we didn't.
It's been a struggle, you know. I mean, for the most part, for years I've worked while I do my political activity.
You're not working right now.
Not right now.
So you stay with friends?
Yeah.
You don't have a home of your own?
No, and if I did, you think I'd sit here and say, where? You know, I have a life, you know.
You do?
Yeah. I'm not a monk, okay?
Does your mother want you to go and get a job and have a color TV and car and things like that?
This is getting a little too personal.
Does she agree with you that it's right to burn the American flag?
She wouldn't do that herself, no. But she thinks that somebody ought to have the right to do it.
You know, and the media is kind of, you see the way the line of questioning is. He's a hippie, right? He's got no permanent address. He doesn't have a job. He's, you know, and they had an encampment and they were protesting. And I mean, that was kind of the role that the RCP played, you know. I mean, they were, and you see the punk rock, you know, he's there giving the finger and he's got his leather jacket on with his keffiyeh. And, you know, they considered themselves to be the real true communists. And a lot of profanity, a lot of flag burning, a lot of nostalgia for the Black Panthers, a lot of talk of violence. That was the Revolutionary Communist Party in the 1980s. And they were just the very visible face of communism in America. And they marched around with pictures of Mao and all of that. And they got flag burning legalized by the Supreme Court. And they talked about violence a lot. And they were just, I don't know, they were just one political trend that existed. And you had the Communist Party of the United States that was aligned with the Soviet Union that said to vote for the Democrats. You had, you had various Trotskyist groups that sold their newspaper. You had the Workers' World Party that was like Soviet aligned, but focused on having big anti-war demonstrations. And then you had the RCP that, you know, cussed up a storm and swore and sold their newspaper and talked about, when we come to power, we're going to have a revolution, and ran a chain of bookstores and, you know, had their leader, Bob Avakian, who was very charismatic and was living in exile in France. And they had like audio cassette tapes of him that they would smuggle back into the country. And I don't know, that was Bob Avakian. That was the RCP. You know, they were just kind of a staple of the radical scene. If you were from Generation X, the Gen X era, right? In the Gen X era, they were just part of the political scene. And, you know, there were a lot of Gen X young people that became anarchists, right? There wasn't much of a left. The Gen X era, the 80s and the 90s, was kind of a period where Marxist and communist politics in the USA was really declining, right? The Soviet Union fell in the early 90s. China's politics had changed in the late 70s. And, you know, overall, U.S. society was becoming more conservative. You had the Reagan Revolution. So it was really not a trendy thing to be a communist during these years. But, you know, to some of the people that were involved in punk rock or whatever, it was, you know, it was just part of the counterculture. And there was still a lot of communist groups left over from the 1970s when it had been quite trendy and quite popular, quite a trendy thing to do. Ultimately, in 2003, you know, and the RCP, they organized protests. They worked to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, the political prisoner, Black Panther, who was facing the death penalty, you know, and ultimately his execution was stopped in 1995. After 9/11, they organized a group called Not in Our Name that organized some big demonstrations opposing the U.S. invasion of Iraq. 2003, the RCP's leader, Bob Avakian, returned to the United States from France. I don't know what the circumstances of his return were, but I guess he couldn't be in the United States. He feared he would be prosecuted, even though the charges had been dropped. But somehow he came back to the United States in 2003. And at that point, the RCP, which had been a major trend in American politics, that had run bookstores, that, you know, got flag burning legalized, that was just kind of, they were just kind of a staple of the radical scene. They started changing very dramatically. And they started saying that, you know, their leader, Bob Avakian, his new synthesis, his teachings were higher than Mao, and they had entered a new stage. And they started expelling most of their members. Most of their members started getting kicked out, especially their younger members. Some of the older members are still with them. And I mean, you know, the group is still around. I've shown some of their stuff on these streams before and reacted to them. But yeah, starting in 2003, after Bob Avakian returned to the United States, the RCP started really falling apart. I mean, they had already kind of lost a lot of their influence, but they were still kind of a staple of the radical scene. But 2003, when Avakian came back and declared, I have this new synthesis, and started expelling people, that was that. Now, what is the political difference here? Well, when it really gets down to it, the politics that these folks are espousing, I would say, is not really Marxism. It's Blanquism. This is Louis Auguste Blanqui. And Louis Auguste Blanqui was a rival of Marx, a guy who lived in the time of Marx's life and was a French radical. And Karl Marx and Louis Auguste Blanqui had a very big difference, a very big political difference. And that difference was that Marx focused on economics. He focused on, you know, the problems of capitalism, the tendency of the falling rate of profit, you know, unemployment, wage labor exploitation. He argued that eventually, because of capitalist technology revolutionizing itself, it would become a necessity that the means of production would be centrally organized. That was Marxism. Louis Auguste Blanqui was a socialist, I guess, from the French socialist movement, who had a very different approach. And his focus was the state. We just have to seize control of the government. We need to organize some kind of military coup. Once we take over, we will declare communism from above. People jokingly call it surprise communism, right? That one day a bunch of soldiers will take over the government, there'll be a coup, and then surprise, it's communism, right? It's kind of joking. And Marx and Blanqui had some rather heated polemics. And, you know, the Paris Commune of 1871 was largely followers of Blanqui. There were some followers of Marx that were involved, but it was largely followers of Blanqui. And Blanqui was a very well-known French radical. And his focus was, we have to have an armed seizure of power. We have to overthrow the state. And once we take control of the state, we'll declare communism. That's not Marxism. Marxism, as an economic theory, focuses on history moving forward and the struggle of the worker against the capitalist. And eventually the capitalist system becomes less and less efficient because technology eliminates the role of the worker. And eventually the working class majority has to rise up and centralize the means of production. That's not what Blanqui believed. Blanqui believed we're just going to get a bunch of people together who believe in justice and liberty and want to end poverty, and we'll have a coup and we'll take over the government. And once we've got the power, we'll make society equal, right? It's just kind of this kind of very military state focused approach. Friedrich Engels wrote, Blanqui is essentially a political revolutionist. He is a socialist only through sentiment, through his sympathy with the sufferings of the people. But he has neither a socialist theory nor a definite practical suggestion for social remedies. In his political activity, he was mainly a man of action, believing that a small, well-organized minority who would attempt a political stroke of force at the opportune moment could carry the mass of people with them by a few successes at the start and thus make a victorious revolution. It's a matter of course that such principles deliver a man hopelessly into the hands of self-deceptions of a fugitive's life and drive him from one folly to another, right? So basically, Blanqui didn't really believe in building a mass movement. He believed that he could build this kind of group of radical people that would, you know, engage in some kind of armed coup. And once they controlled the state, they would take power. And if you listen to these young Maoists that exist today, you listen to the RCP after the 1980s, there's really very, very little talk of the problems of the capitalist mode of production, the tendency of the falling rate of profit, overproduction. They don't know about any of that. And even the economics of imperialism, they're not really, they say imperialism is a system. They know that, but do they know about, imperialism holding back development and keeping countries in poverty? No. Their focus is, the people that run the government are ruthless and evil, and we're going to get our guns together and we're going to take power, and then they won't be ruthless and evil. I mean, it's a very, very simplistic approach that focuses mainly just on the state. It is mainly about the state. And I'll show you, this is from their recruiting film. They say they will, from 1987. You can see this is their politics. What's interesting is they don't even talk this way anymore. They've completely changed since 2003. But in the 80s, this was the line they put out. And this is more or less what these Maoist clubs believe.
Rival in the Soviet Union, right? And in the midst of this, they're kind of like trying to keep the empire together. And here, people are rising up in South Africa. And then next day, literally next day, they got to bring their Sixth Fleet from the Persian Gulf to the over to the Philippines, and it's, creating a tremendous, I think, source of strain and problems for them. Our party is a participant in the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, along with 18 other parties and organizations from around the world, including the Communist Party of Peru, who is right now leading People's War, armed struggle inside Peru. So definitely, those things we have going for us, in terms of the forces on a world scale.
When your system of government is in place, what's going to happen? Are we going to have room for dissent and all that stuff, and people can say their mind? And
well, a lot of people who've been miseducated about what we're talking about, will call on the radio shows I'm on or something, they'll say, listen, when you're in power, I won't even be able to criticize you, which is the farthest thing from the truth. In fact, we have to say to them is, listen, the biggest problem with people like you is getting you to criticize us once we're in power, because if you'll put up with what's going on to this system now, you'll put up with anything. But I'm not going to dodge a question here. As far as the capitalists who've been overthrown, and new capitalists who want to rise in the party, like Khrushchev or Deng Xiaoping and those people in China now who are running the society and subjecting the masses to oppression while they're letting the privileged sectors run wild, those kind of people will not be allowed to organize and try to put the masses back in the hell that they've done. There will be freedom for the masses, the majority. There will not be freedom for exploiters, because if exploiters are free to exploit, then the majority of people are not free to be free of that exploitation.
so that if under your system I'm doing this show and there's a guy who wants to come on and say about you guys,
well, we're going to run the television. Our party's going to lead the masses. No question about that.
You mean you're going to run the whole shooting match?
Our party's going to lead the people in running it. We're not going to lead the people in making revolution, then disappear and abdicate leadership. The people are going to want and demand that the people that lead this revolution take responsibility for leading them to reshape the society. And we're not going to say, well, so long, we led you, now you're on your own.
We probably could, right now, take over a city, maybe even this city, a police station or whatever, take over the city, and a lot of people are digging. They probably come in and join up and we hold out for a couple of days or what have you, like this here. But then after that, things will be back to like what they are and shit. And so the only reason we're not doing something like, because we want to win, we want to bring these suckers all the way down and create a whole new revolutionary society and stuff. And people got to become like part of the process to help bring that about. Bring about the situation, so that when we do launch with the guns and the arms and our hundreds of thousands and millions like this here, that we have at least a decent chance at winning.
Yeah, there's no talk of an economic program that they put forward to fix things. There's no talk of building a movement. It's all just, we're going to overthrow the state. We're going to get guns together and we're going to overthrow the state. And it's Blanquism, right? And this is Louis Auguste Blanqui. I mean, this is what Marx criticized. Marx criticized this trend that is believing that a small armed minority, not the masses of people, are the makers of history. And I'll show you a couple other clips from the film.
Ganar. Y el punto de este partido, el Partido Comunista Revolucionario, es exactamente para preparar a las masas por el tiempo cuando es posible recoger las armas y lanzar una insurrección armada. Pero este tiempo es crítico en la preparación política.
hands-on struggle 24 hours a day, you know, going to punk shows and selling our magazine, you know, being in the middle of like Hiroshima and Nagasaki Day, and, you know, preparing for that like all throughout the summer.
One part in our Principles of Unity says turning every, I don't remember exactly what it is, something about, turning every outbreak
of protest
into schools of war. And that's basically what that's basically what we were concentrating on, you know, learning how to do that. We're training. The study group is different from school. In normal public schools, you get taught what to learn, you know, and not how to learn. It's a science to be applied, you know, so it's not going to be this is one thing that I really like about it. It's not going to be this given set of rules that you follow, you know, in your day-to-day activity. This is what you will do, and this is what you will follow. You know, it's not dogmatic. It's continuous. I mean, it progresses along with the situation in the world, you know, along with everything happening in the world.
And according to each, like, for example, like, the way that the science is applied to the U.S. is not the way it be applied to Turkey, for example. You know, the way it's applied to England is not the way it's applied to Peru.
I mean, the fact that we're using Marxism and Leninism and Mao Zedong thought reflects that, because a lot of what they've written, it applies to their time.
Yeah.
What's going on in the world at their time. And you think, well, shit, that's what we're following now, you know? Doesn't make sense, but it does make sense because it is a science and it can be applied now.
Yeah, one thing about the RCP that was particularly unattractive was they really, really focused on atheism. You know, they were really, they made a point of getting up and saying there is no God, you know, and other offensive things. And actually, this is very similar to what Blanqui did. You know, that this is Frederick Engels, criticized Blanqui. He said, the point with them is then to be more radical in the matter of atheism than all others. Fortunately, it requires no great heroism to be an atheist nowadays. Atheism is practically accepted by the European working men's parties. In order to show they are the most radical, God is abolished by decree. You know, and it's like, I mean, it's particularly, I mean, you know, they focused on offending people, you know, burning the American flag, you know, they're going to abolish God, there is no God, and no economic program, no talk of building a mass movement. It's just, this system is evil, and we want to prepare for an armed civil war, right? Every struggle is a struggle, you know, every struggle is a school of war. You know, that this is an ultra leftist trend. But in the 80s and 90s, it was probably the most visible expression of communism that you saw in U.S. society. They had the bookstore. You know, when I was a kid in the 2000s, early 2000s, and in Cleveland, they had a bookstore, and they returned my phone calls. Most of the communist groups didn't return my phone calls, and they sent me their newspaper. And, you know, they were a group that was out there every day promoting communism on college campuses, etc. And that's a whole nother story. But anyhow, you know, there were a number of people that had been around the RCP and had a falling out, or starting like 2005 to 2010, the RCP started expelling people in big numbers and focusing on Bob Avakian's New Synthesis. There were a number of other trends that were around this kind of politics. They had denounced China after the rise of Deng Xiaoping. They were admiring the shining path in Peru. They were fixating on armed struggle. They didn't talk about economic demands. And they very much kind of romanticized the idea of an armed struggle, and they liked China, but they didn't like China after Mao. There was a group called the Maoist Internationalist Movement, and it was led by an academic, a Korean-American academic named Henry Park, who taught at Harvard and Ann Arbor University, and he had his own like breakaway from the RCP called the Maoist Internationalist Movement. And they were very secretive. They had a newspaper they would distribute. And there was a book that was published called Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat. And the idea was that white people in America are not working class because they of their white privilege. They benefit from racism too much to be revolutionary. And this book is all about how white Americans are actually settlers. You know, they're like bosses, they're like managers. They're not actually workers. And so there's no potential to build a revolution in the United States because of the white majority. And the Maoist internationalist movement circulated that, and that was their point of disagreement. The RCP thought you could have a revolution in America. The Maoist internationalist movement said you couldn't. There was a group in New York City, 2006 to 2008. You had a number of people that had been kicked out of the RCP. They formed something called the Single Spark Collective, and they were just a group of people that, you know, they had been in the RCP. They were my age or older, and they had been in the RCP. They didn't accept Bob's new synthesis, or they did something wrong. They got kicked out. There was something called the Kasama Project. Kasama is the word in Filipino that means comrade in Filipino. And so there was a group of ex-RCPers that had the Kasama Project, 9 letters to our comrades. And there was a huge amount of worship of the Shining Path in Peru. And the Shining Path in Peru is a particularly violent, extreme group. You know, when I met Peruvian communists at the World Youth Festival in Ecuador, I asked them about the Shining Path, and they said they thought they were CIA agents. And they said the Shining Path, it was this communist group that no one had ever heard of. And, you know, it would be, you know, they had, you know, there was the Communist Party of Peru. There were like various communist groups in Peru, and, you know, they'd just be having their meeting, and, you know, and then randomly a very poor person, a peasant, would walk in to their meeting with a gun and shout, "Viva Presidente Gonzalo," and just start shooting everyone. And then everyone would be ducking under the tables and trying not to get shot. And, you know, the Communist Party of Peru, they thought Cuba was not a real communist country, so they blew up the Cuban embassy. They thought China was not a real communist country that Deng Xiaoping had sold out. They blew up the Chinese embassy. And they were this very, very violent group that recruited a lot of indigenous people in Peru in the 80s and 90s. And they waged a civil war. And they, you know, they beheaded priests, and they committed horrendous atrocities. And one of their main targets was communist groups in Peru, because they thought they were all revisionists or sellouts. And then they arrested the leader, Presidente Gonzalo, the leader, and he signed a surrender, and they surrendered. And it was a very strange insurgent group in Peru that no one hates more than Peruvian communists, actually. Peruvian communists think they, you know, and in fact, the president of Peru, the leftist president they had, who was impeached, one of the reasons he was impeached was his foreign minister said that he believed, you know, the Shining Path was a CIA group. And, you know, in response to the Shining Path, you know, Fujimori became the dictator. Right. So Fujimori became kind of the dictator, was able to establish a military dictatorship in response to the population kind of being terrified of the Shining Path. Shining Path was not a good group, but the RCP, they supported the Shining Path. And it actually was kind of weird. You know, they generally didn't support most leftist or communist governments around the world. They supported the Shining Path. And Amnesty International set up picket lines outside of their bookstores at one point, which is pretty wild. And people wonder if there was some deep state on deep state stuff going on. And BBC, you know, generally the Shining Path was described as a terrorist group, but BBC ran kind of a sympathetic documentary about the Shining Path called People of the Shining Path. And there are still Shining Path people in Peru. There are certain areas in very, very, you know, impoverished, like rural areas in Peru where the Shining Path still is in power. Right. There are still like leaders of the Communist Party of Nepal, or the Communist Party of Peru, Maoist, or whatever they're called, that still control certain areas. They're just an insurgent group. Right. That, you know, they used to control a lot of Peru. They don't have a lot of control anymore. And communists in Peru can't stand them, but they expressed this kind of ultra Maoist, you know, violence focused political line. And these people tended to admire them. So what happened? Well, in the 2010s, you had, you know, the rise of Black Lives Matter. And, you know, I remember, you know, it used to be that, you know, the Black community talked about police brutality. You had the killing of Sean Bell, right? You had the Rodney King and the LA Rebellion. The Black community talked about it, and communists talked about it, and nobody else did. You know, and I remember I was in college in a rural area, and I was a communist. I was a member of the Workers' World Party, and I would talk about police brutality in Cleveland, and all my classmates would say, "That's not real. My uncle's a cop. He said there's no such thing as police brutality. It's just made up." You know, and there was just this constant, you know, like, you know, police brutality was kind of a taboo subject, and that, you know, and communist activists talked about it, and, you know, Black activists, Nation of Islam, Black nationalists, and they talked about it, but it was kind of a taboo subject. 2010 or so, you know, after the Trayvon Martin case, and especially during the Obama presidency, you had the rebellion that took place in Ferguson, Missouri. You had the 2015 uprising in Baltimore, and Black Lives Matter became a very trendy thing. It became a very trendy cause, right? And now, I mean, talk of police brutality, talk of Black Lives Matter, that's a really trendy thing now, right? It used to be only communists talked about it, and only the Black community that was actually suffering from it, and Black activists talked about it, but it became something that was just kind of widespread, you know, talk of police brutality, you know, talk of the Black Revolutionary Movement. And part of Black Lives Matter was Black Panther nostalgia. And Black Panther nostalgia is, you know, I mean, it's true. A lot of these young liberals now walk around with shirts with, you know, Assata Shakur on them, or Fred Hampton, or Huey Newton. You know, that's a part of being a liberal now, is that you think the Black Panthers were a great group. Now, they know very little about what the Black Panthers actually stood for, right? The Black Panthers supported North Korea and sent delegations to North Korea regularly, published Kim Il-sung's writings. They don't know that. The Black Panthers were an explicitly Marxist-Leninist organization that did, you know, distribute Mao's Little Red Book and study it. The liberals don't know that. But among some of the younger people that were inspired by Black Lives Matter and all of that, some of them actually did do the research. And so some of them became attracted to Maoist communist politics, because if you look at the history of Black radicals in America, it's a really big part of 1970s Black radicalism. Angela Davis and, you know, I mean, go down the line, right? That, you know, if you actually do investigate, you know, this stuff, you will learn that indeed there is a Maoist communist influence. So there was a lot more interest in this kind of politics. It wasn't as fringe because of Black Lives Matter, because, you know, there was a documentary about the Black Panthers on PBS that they did that was widely circulated. This kind of politics actually started to gain some, you know, more of a wider following. And in New York City, there was a group called the Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee. And it was a group of these young Maoists, basically. And they weren't in the RCP. They were their own thing. They were young ultra Maoists. And they started a club at City College or City University of New York. And I was politically active at this time. And in a way, we saw it as kind of a very inspiring thing. These are young people, and you know, New York City is very multinational. You have people from many different countries, and it was very multiracial. And one of their leaders was a guy of Bangladeshi descent. They had, you know, they had people of Latin American descent. They had Black activists, and there was about maybe 60 people in the organization. Maybe not even that, maybe 30. And they were an official club at City University of New York. And they espoused, they called it proletarian feminism, was what they called their political line. But they were Maoist communists. And they were all in their 20s, their teens and 20s. And they had this like Maoist communist club at City University. They had a little bit of energy. And so this happened. David Petraeus, who was the former CIA director, and, you know, long time, you know, and was linked to massacres in Iraq. David Petraeus started teaching classes at City University. And they, as, you know, anti-imperialists or whatever, they started confronting him at his classes. And this video went viral. This was the Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee. It was one of the first of these kind of local teen Maoist clubs. This was the one in New York City. Not a big group, but they confronted David Petraeus when he was teaching. And this is what happened. And this video, this created a big splash when it happened. This was international news.
This is General Petraeus. He's over manslaughter right here. You disgusting imperialist. You're nothing but a disgusting imperialist. You know. You like that, right? You will. Nope. Go to the media. Piece of shit. We're here. All over you. I can you scumbag. You're watching you now. Fuck out of CUNY. Piece of shit. Why are you teaching at CUNY? What do you have to say? Every class, David! Every class, David!
They're chanting every class, David, meaning they're going to follow him around at every class. I mean, this was kind of, I mean, I don't oppose this. David Petraeus is a mass murderer, one of the main architects of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. CIA director, and they decided to, confront him about his crimes against the people of the world. I don't see a problem with this at all. I mean, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't use the foul language that they're using. I would try to do it in more of a winning way, maybe make clearer points. But you know what? So what? I mean, they did. This was a pretty heroic thing they did.
Every class, David! Every class, David! Every class, David! Every
Don't worry,
war criminal! Betray us out of cutie! 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 Betray us out of cutie!
That's betraying! He's a war criminal! He's a war criminal! He's a war criminal right here! He deserves to be tried!
What you doing in our school? You should get out of our school system. You don't belong here. You're just nothing but a war criminal. Disgusting. You should be ashamed of yourself, goddammit.
Yeah, and that was a big deal. Now, what happened? This group that was formed at CUNY, they were formed, and I remember it was kind of a big deal. And they were not aligned with any communist group. They were from this kind of ultra Maoist, like ex-RCP, post-RCP tradition. And they formed at CUNY, and it was later revealed the city of New York, the NYPD, spent $20 million to destroy the organization. And they did it. They did it very effectively. And at the time, we didn't know exactly what was happening. I was in the Workers' World Party, and we wanted to be friendly to them. We wanted to align with them. And there were other communist groups that tried to be friendly to them. And at the time, they had informants. The NYPD had informants inside of the group. And, the state worked very hard. And it was later revealed a couple of them were charged with crimes. And at their trial, it was revealed that, the NYPD had a whole room, the RSCC room that they had set up. They had informants inside of the group. They had spent $20 million to surveil them and all of that. And they destroyed the organization. They ultimately were able to destroy the group. And I'll get to that later. I mean, the way it was destroyed. And this was one of the first of these kind of like local Maoist clubs. What made the Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee different is most of these local Maoist clubs tend to be suburban white kids. The RSCC was not. It was not a majority white organization. It was majority people of color. And it was, because it's New York City, it was very multinational. You had like a guy from Bangladesh. You had people of Chicano background. You had people from different parts of the world. So it was much more multinational. You had Arab American activists. And it wasn't big, but they were on the campus. They were going after David Petraeus. And at the time, when there were two of their leaders that were facing very serious criminal charges, a young man named Khalil and a young man named Taffy. And they were facing very, very serious charges. And I went to all the protests to support them. And what I remember was, the protests were very, very hard to go to. I would kind of be embarrassed for them a little bit, I would be at the protests, and it would just be all the communist groups that were at City University of New York. And, I was at one thing, and they introduced one of the defendants, and they said, "We have the chairman of the Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee." And he got up there, and, his girlfriend standing next to him with a big picture of Mao. And he got up there and he's like, "I just would like to correct you. I am not the chairman of the Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee. I am the general secretary." It was just so silly. And so, and they published a document, and a lot of communists thought the whole group was a police organization. I don't think that was the case. I think there were some very sincere people involved. The group was heavily infiltrated, but there were some sincere people. But like, they circulated a document at one point, that it was like, make CUNY a base area for people's war, is what they called it. Make CUNY a base area for people's war. And again, it's this, they're always talking about violence. They're always talking about revolution and guns and killing, pick up the gun. There was just this ultra leftist vibe to them. They were always talking about violence and things like that. And they destroyed the group. Now, it splintered into 5 or 6 different factions that are still in existence. They're still in existence in New York City, various breakaways. There are breakaways that exist. Another thing that happened was in 2015, there was an organization called the Red Guards of Austin. And it was a similar group of people, ex-RCP, former RCP people who, they had the pro Shining Path line, and they did a series of provocative things. And I think they attacked an anti-abortion conference, and they went in and like set off smoke bombs in an anti-abortion conference that was going on because they wanted to fight for women's rights or whatever. And they had a demonstration against Alex Jones where they carried firearms around and things like that. They were just a very provocative, in-your-face Maoist communist group in Austin, Texas. And that this just kind of became a national trend. Now, at the time that the Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee of CUNY, when it existed, I was shocked to learn how much the NYPD spent to go after them. And I mean, part of that is that they had embarrassed, CUNY and targeted David Petraeus, a former CIA director. But it was more than that. And I remember talking with people, like, why did they spend so much money to go after that? And I realized what it was, which was that the communist groups in America, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the Workers' World Party, the Communist Party USA, everything they did was predictable. Everybody knew exactly what they were going to do before they did it. However, this was a new group of younger people. They were all in their teens and 20s. There were very few older folks involved. There were some older people that would come to their stuff, but it was mainly young people. And their actions were unpredictable. Right. Whereas these old communist groups, they knew exactly what they were going to do. Their actions were unpredictable, and they had targeted a former CIA director, and they did have, an anti-war, anti-imperialist position. And, there was a fear that this could lead to, some kind of threat, that there could be, genuinely some kind of revolutionary group that was recruiting people in big numbers. And, and so, that seems to be something that the government in America has learned, right? I always think about this, the U.S. government goes around the world making sure countries don't have communist revolutions all over the world. Do you think they're ever going to just sit back and let some communist group set up shop in America and not fight them? And that a lot of times the American government, it seems like when they're dealing with leftist groups, they do, hit an ant with a sledgehammer. It's like they use unnecessary force, but they're getting ahead, right? They would rather hit the ant with a sledgehammer while it's still an ant than wait, for it to become, a cockroach or to become something bigger that then they couldn't hit with a sledgehammer. And that seems to be kind of the American government's approach with these groups. Is it's like rather than let them flourish and then go after them, get them before they turn into something. And that's kind of interesting as well. So anyhow, let's just talk about the group dynamics of these groups. Because now at this point, there's one of these groups in every major city. There's one in Minneapolis. There's, I think, two in Minneapolis. There's multiple groups in New York City. There's multiple groups in Chicago. There's multiple groups in Los Angeles. I mean, it's just, and they all tend to be teens and 20-year-olds. They're not in any communist group. And that's what's interesting. What's interesting about them is that, generally when I was coming up, if you were young and you were interested in communism, you looked for American communist groups and you joined them. They haven't done that. They've become attracted to Maoist communist politics on their own, usually by discovering it on the internet, and they start their own group, and their group is, small. And, we're going to get into where do these groups kind of come from. Right, because these kind of politics are on the internet. You can get these kind of politics on the internet, but there's a layer of these people that feel it's not enough to simply be on the internet. They want to start their own group. So where do these groups start? Well, at risk of sounding like a feminist or something like that, I'll just say these groups all start with a bro. They start with a bro, right? And they tend to be white and suburban. Not always, like RSCC was not white and suburban, but they tend to be white and suburban. And they start with a bro, with a young man, a young teenage boy who's somewhat charismatic and is attracted to communist history, is smart enough to, learn about the injustices of U.S. society. Lately, Palestine has been something a lot of these younger people organize around. They understand U.S. support for Israel is wrong. The Palestinians are being killed. It's a young male, usually a young white male in a suburban area who is smart enough to, question American politics to some degree or other, and also kind of has big aspirations. He wants to become a great revolutionary leader, and usually he gets his hands on one of these, the little red book, and he reads this. This is a pretty good piece of political propaganda. It's written very poetically. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. He who fears not death by 1,000 cuts dares to unhorse the emperor. This is a very poetic little book, and it's a lot about violence and revolution and rage at the status quo. And there's a very much an Oedipal thing, right? Mao, he was building a movement of teenagers in the 1930s when he built the Chinese, Red Army, and then the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guards, that was also teenagers. And it kind of speaks to kind of that Oedipal libidinal drive that a lot of young men have. And it usually starts with a bro, young guy. But then he has a girlfriend. And this is also very interesting to see the dynamics. So there's a young guy who gets into communism. He gets a little red book. He wants to be a communist leader. And then he gets a girlfriend. And the girlfriend kind of becomes the mom, right? And she sees the bro as kind of this romantic, misunderstood loner, right? And she sees him as, oh, he's so smart and he believes in social justice, but he's misunderstood and he doesn't have a lot of friends. But I'm gonna, as his boyfriend, I'm gonna kind of care for him. No one cares for him. And I am gonna help him build an organization, and I'm gonna build a group of people that'll understand him. And actually the girlfriend actually usually has more to do with organizing the group than the guy does. The guy is the one espousing this kind of Maoist politics he learned from the internet or from the little red book. And the guy usually, is up on the latest gossip about communism on the internet and knows why every other communist group is wrong and, whatever. But it tends to be the woman who is actually building the group. And she's building the group kind of because she wants him to not be isolated, because she kind of looks up to him as this misunderstood artist It's kind of like the James Dean bad boy thing. And then the group tends to be made up of less confident males, right? So the guy who starts the group is usually quite confident and thinks of himself as, a great revolutionary or whatever. He has a girlfriend. The girlfriend is encouraging him to build a group. And then they tend to attract guys that are more bookish, more chronically online, as they say. They kind of look up to the guy as, he's braver than they are. He's charismatic, right? They kind of look up to him and want to be him. And the groups never really grow to be more than 10 people, sometimes 15, sometimes 20, but that's pushing it. I mean, you saw this was the group in New York City. I think the group in New York City calls itself Behind Enemy Lines, and their rally, they all had their faces covered up, and it is right to rebel, bring the war home, and they've got their faces covered up. There's 20 people in the group, and this is New York City. This is not a small place. There's 20 people in the whole group, and they're teenagers, or whatever. And, one of the guys was clearly the leader of the group and was clearly the guy, and his girlfriend was the one who burned the flag. And, and then there's a couple other people that aren't as confident as he is, who kind of look up to him. And that tends to be the group. Now, what happens? A couple things happen. And these people, they tend to then do whatever the left is doing, right? When the Democrats are having a No Kings rally, they'll show up at the No Kings rally and wave, red flags with hammers and sickles, or wave pictures of Mao. They'll, if the left is having a Black Lives Matter rally, they'll come. And sometimes they're disruptive, to their credit, and other times not. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But sometimes they're disruptive at these events. Other times they're just kind of there saying we're communists and we support, this, whatever the latest trendy liberal cause is, right? They're there. They'll be there and they'll do their thing. And to some degree or other, it's just kind of a group of friends. They all get together and they watch movies. They're all interested in communism, right? And they watch movies about, about communist history. They watch movies about the Black Panthers. They watch movies about Mao. They have study sessions. They read the same books. They're just kind of a group of friends. And eventually the group falls apart. How does it fall apart? Generally what happens is that they grow out of it, right? Is that they're no longer high school and college aged, and they've got bills to pay and they've got kids to feed, in some cases, the bro gets his girlfriend pregnant and suddenly he has to, pay the bills. And so he can't be out doing communism all the time. He's got to get a regular job. Another thing that happens, this is very common. This happened with the Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee. This has happened with the Red Guards of Austin. is there some kind of sexual drama. You know, sometimes the bro cheats on the woman. Sometimes there's allegations of sexual harassment. Sometimes the woman breaks up with the bro and decides he's an evil sexist abuser, and that, you know, and then wants the whole group to expel him or whatever. Sometimes there's some sexual drama, but generally, you know, they are able to kind of play up the rivalries, the jealousies of the bro who started the group. There's jealousy of him. There's sexual drama around him, and that destroys the group. And that's what happened to Red Guards of Austin. That's what happened to the Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee. And the details are kind of unimportant. They're uninteresting. They're usually hyper complicated and not very interesting, right? There's a breakup. The girlfriend decides the guy is a toxic sexist and wants the group to expel him, and half the group will and half the group won't, and all of that. That's one thing that happens. Or, you know, it just, I don't know. They all decide, they turn on the leaders and decide that they're a cult and they're abusive. I mean, it's just childish stuff. Now, these groups tend to be very, very hostile to other communist groups, like DSA and stuff. But some of the communist groups have gotten better at handling them. PSL, for example, is better at dealing with the local Maoist club. They're good at dealing with them. They've figured out a way to kind of include them in their rallies, let them speak on the bullhorn. You know, they've figured that out. But I will say that what's interesting about these groups is they will never join PSL because PSL doesn't want the bro, right? PSL wants the other members of the group. They don't want the bro because the bro has his own ideas, thinks for himself, has read theory on his own. They don't want that, right? So, you know, and these other communist groups don't really want these groups, right? Because they don't want strong leaders. They don't want anything like that. So, you know, and whatever the leftists are doing, they're on the margins of whatever the left is doing. And they're there kind of handing out leaflets about communism, telling you to join their group. When I was in LA, for example, they were having anti-ICE protests, ICE out of LA. I was there covering them. And one night I was there, and, you know, the local Maoist teenage Maoist club was there. It was called like Dare to Struggle LA, something like that. And they were really mad that, you know, they were chanting peaceful protest because they believe in violent revolution. And so they got all their people on the bullhorn. No, you can't say peaceful protest. We want violent revolution. And they divided the march, and they had the one that was led by the Maoist communists was over here, and they were talking about communism, and all the other people were chanting peaceful protest. And sometimes they will play a disruptive role. Other times they just kind of go along with it and are just functioning on the margins of whatever the liberals are doing, calling themselves communists. And they're kind of just a group of friends. And that's what's important to remember. And I'll get to that. So deep state intrigue. Why do these groups exist? Well, first of all, these groups don't really set up shop. Right. I mean, you know, the Party for Socialism and Liberation has offices around the country and stuff. You know, the RCP, they still have a couple bookstores around the country, you know, but these groups will never do that. They just are kind of a group of friends that go to protest. They give themselves a name. They set up a little website. They usually have leaflets that they hand out. They never really set up shop, you know, because they're to some degree or other, they're just kind of a group of friends, but they do activism. They give themselves a name, and often they will do things that are that try to get themselves attention. And I'll get to that. So why do these groups exist? Well, sometimes, you know, in order for an organization to exist, any political group, it has to serve a purpose. Right? If a political group doesn't serve a purpose, it doesn't exist. It has to have a function. And I've talked about that. You have to have a function to exist. What is the function? I was in the Workers' World Party for many years. What was Workers' World's function? It was to run anti-war protests, liberal anti-war protests, basically. The Communist Party, what is their function? Well, they are a group that, you know, has relations and sends people to Cuba and sends people to Vietnam and sends people to China and urges them to vote for the Democratic Party. They play a role within the labor unions, kind of connecting the labor union bureaucracy to the various communist governments. You know, they're a relic from a time past, and they're not as functional, but they have a lot of infrastructure left over. They serve a purpose, right? And, you know, even the RCP, when they existed, they served a purpose. You know, they were kind of there to represent nostalgia for the 1960s, for the Black Panthers. They had bookstores, and they were kind of seen as the far left alternative, keeping the flame of the 1960s radicalism alive. You know, you have to have a function. So what is the function? In some cases, these teenage Maoist clubs seem to actively be antagonizing the left. And that's kind of interesting, right? The Red Guards of Austin in particular, they made a point of harassing other communist groups. They actually tried to get into the CPI convention that we did. The first public CPI event that we had was in Austin, Texas, and they tried to get in and attack the event. We had good enough security. They weren't able to, but they tried, actually. And we received many threatening messages from the Red Guards of Austin before our first event that we did. But we hired good security, and people went through metal detectors, and they weren't able to get in and cause us trouble, which was very good. But I mean, the Red Guards of Austin, one thing they did was that they made a point of, like, they took the head of a pig, a dead pig's head, and they nailed it to the wall of DSA's office, the Democratic Socialist Office of America's office in Austin, Texas, and wrote DSA are revisionist pigs on it. It's like, ew, gross, and there's a dead pig's head with a bunch of flies on it, and they spray painted that. And in downtown Austin, I still saw it. It's like on one of the highways, it's spray painted Viva Presidente Gonzalo. I mean, and most people, I only know what that is because I know Gonzalo was the founder of the Shining Path in Peru. Most people don't know what that is. Like the Shining Path, like most people don't know that. Maybe you should have put like Long Live Communism or Down with Capitalism. People would know what that is. Most people, Gonzalo, what? Most people don't know what that is. I mean, it's kind of silly, but they kind of exist. And, and the Red Guards of Austin were known to kind of jump leftists, right? They would, leaders of DSA would have their cars vandalized and things like that. And, there's a group in Portland, the Rose City Antifa, and they're anarchists. They're anarchists, and they kind of play a similar role of like harassing different leftist groups. And, so there was that. The other thing, though, that concerns me is that there is a bit of an adventurist streak. Again, a lot of rhetoric about guns, a lot of rhetoric about armed civil war, people's war, we're going to overthrow. There's a lot of that. And there's provocateur stuff. I don't know the politics of this group, the UFC terror ring that they caught. I guess they were supposed to be against capitalism. They wanted to spark a revolution. I don't think they were Maoists or anything like that, but there is deep state intrigue. Another thing that these groups do is that they're just the scare porn for Fox News. Is that they're out there with big pictures of Mao and big hammers and sickles and red flags, and they scare the crap out of conservatives. And I've seen so many videos on conservatives where they go and there's a Black Lives Matter rally, and there's, the local Maoist club is there with their hammers and sickles and their red flags. And then the video is, oh, see, all the Democrats are Maoist communists, and Mao killed a gajillion million people. And, that's why you should vote for Trump, is because the Democrats are all Maoist communists. There's a lot of that, right? There's a whole industry of this. Trevor Loudon, and there's this woman who does Socialism Saturday, who is just a complete fool. I went on one of her streams. I wrote in the chat that Roy Singham funds PSL, and she shouted, "Don't spread conspiracy theories. You can't say that." And she blocked me. And now everybody knows Roy Singham funds PSL, but she's so clueless. She's the expert on socialism, and she blocked me. "Oh my God, you can't say that. You're spreading conspiracy theories in my chat. No. I mean, she's just a fool, like Karen Boyko or something. And she's got all these, interviews on Fox News. I infiltrated Antifa, and it's just silly. It's just silly stuff. And it's just childish, silly stuff. And it's just utterly silly, utterly silly stuff. And it's not even worth engaging. I mean, and, so what purpose do these groups serve? Counter gangs to antagonize the left. There's the possibility they could be used in like false flag, deep state kind of stuff. They create scare porn for conservatives. They scare conservatives. The other thing, though, is that they're kind of an off-ramp for dissidents. Because, again, these groups they don't set up shop anywhere. They never really dig roots into the masses. They're kind of a group of friends. And eventually they all kind of grow out of it. And they just, they have jobs and kids. They're no longer high school and college aged. And they have to just kind of move on with their lives. Or they have a big fight among themselves. And, it's just it's this whole thing about communism as a college phase. Right. And that's been a big problem in American political culture. I would say, since the 1970s, really, since the 1980s. The notion has been that, joining a communist group, whether it's a Maoist group or a Trotskyist group, whatever, it's just something you do when you're in college, right? When you're college age, you're young and you're idealistic, and you join one of these groups, and then you're in it for 1 or 2 years, and you realize they're never really going to grow. They're not a serious political force, and so then you move on with your life, and you just kind of laugh about, oh, my silly college years back when I was a communist. And it's kind of sad. And that's what PSL is. PSL is a college phase. There was another group called the ISO, the International Socialist Organization. It was like a Trotskyist group that was like that. And that's kind of what communism in America was supposed to be. And even today, that's kind of what it is. And these groups, even though they're not technically affiliated with any communist group, they're kind of just independent little groups. That's what they kind of carry on, that tradition of communism as a college phase. So do these groups have any potential? I would say no. I would say they don't. Occasionally, these groups are anti-imperialist, right? They might protest in support of Cuba or Venezuela or North Korea occasionally. Most of the time, they don't. Most of the time, they denounce all those countries. They absolutely hate Russia. Oh, Russia's fascist. Anyone who supports Russia is a Nazi. They all have Trump derangement syndrome. They all think that anyone who's slightly conservative is actually Hitler, and they're pro-Palestine usually, because that's trendy among leftists, but they don't support Iran. They don't, every country that's not the way they would want, is not pure Maoist communism. They don't support. They absolutely hate modern China. They tend to focus on LGBT stuff. I mean, they're not very anti-imperialist, but when pro-Palestine became very trendy among college-age leftists, they were pro-Palestine, and they are pro-Palestine. But are they pro-Iran? No. Are they pro-China or pro-Russia? No. Are they pro-Cuba? Not really. Occasionally, some of them are. But, they tend to be cut off. They're not really anti-imperialist. They just want to kind of wave the flag of communism. And they don't have any understanding of economics. And that is the biggest problem with them. They're not interested in economics. They are attracted to political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, red flag, revolution. They don't care about economics, right? They're Blanquists. They're not Marxists. Their understanding is the state is bad. The state is run by evil, racist people. But when we take over with guns in our hands, it'll be right. It's kind of like what I showed you in that RCP video. They've kind of stripped the economics out of Marxism, and they've turned Marxism into, they like the aesthetics. They like the red flag and all of that. If there's any hope for these kind of groups, it's with that charismatic male, that bro that starts the group. If he stays politically active, right? If he, goes through his 20s and continues to be politically active, and matures, it's possible that he could develop a deeper understanding. That's really the only hope for the group, is that charismatic male at the center of the group. He has some aspirations to be a real political leader of something. And if he's smart enough, and if he's committed enough, if he keeps going, there's a chance. And, you meet some of these people that have been doing this long enough. A lot of them just get very demoralized, but some of them, they have been doing it long enough. They've seen the holes in how the mainstream of the left operates. They come to understand that Iran is actually standing up for the Palestinians and the Houthis and Hezbollah. And they start to understand that Russia is not our enemy, and that Russia, and they start to kind of get it. But a lot of them just get very demoralized. I've met a lot of people that used to be in this kind of politics, and they just get demoralized. It's depressing. But, ultimately, yes, if the charismatic male who's the leader of one of these groups can keep going and bring a few people with him, there's potential. But ultimately, these groups are to be avoided. And I wish I could tell you the opposite. I wish I could tell you that, these groups, go and talk to them, be patient with them. No, don't. Honestly, I'll tell you, it's dangerous to be around these groups. I mean, they're dangerous. They're very, very dangerous. Why are they dangerous? They're dangerous for a couple reasons. One, their politics is so loaded with rage and anger, that they will turn on a dime. One day, these people are your best friend. They love you. And the next day, you're evil and they want to destroy you. A lot of these groups have no problem being violent against other people in the movement, right? Again, they went to DSA's office and nailed a dead pig. They've beat up, the Red Guards of Austin made a point of going and assaulting members of rival communist groups pretty frequently. They have no problem being violent to other political groups. One day they're your friend and then they decide you're a revisionist. Part of that's just being young. That's how young people are. Young people can be very fickle, etc. They're very young and they're very confused. And a lot of them, they're trying to reenact the past. They're trying to be the Black Panthers. They're trying to be Maoist revolutionaries. They don't quite know what they're doing. And because they don't know what they're doing, they're very unpredictable. And they will engage in either adventurous stuff that'll get them in jail. I think there was one of these groups was it Connecticut or Boston that, some of their members were facing some serious prison time for something they did around Palestine solidarity. And that they will engage in illegal activities to prove how revolutionary they are. And that's dangerous, right? And on top of that, they can be very just emotional and hostile. The problem with these groups, I'll just tell you, the biggest problem is that, again, they're not interested in economics. They're not interested in anything but, society is bad, revolution, gun, overthrow. They have that rage-filled Oedipal libidinal politics. And they tend to have a culture where you're obligated to argue, to fight, right? They read the essay by Mao Zedong called Combat Liberalism, which says that if you disagree with something, you can't just let it go. You have to, it's your obligation to let it all out and fight. And because of that, they tend to be very hostile and have a lot of ugly, kind of struggle session kind of stuff. And they generate a level of hostility. And honestly, I would just avoid these people because it's not simply a matter of them being wrong. They're dangerous. I mean, they are. I mean, they're dangerous. That's not to say that there aren't people that are in these kind of spaces like myself. My story is a little bit different. I'm 10 to 15 years older than most of these people. And because of that, there was still, the RCP was still strong and going when I was in my teens. And, I ended up joining a group. I didn't join one of these, but, I was a young bro, I guess you could say. I grew up in a rural area, not the suburbs, but, I was a young bro who was attracted to the Little Red Book and all of that. So I'm not saying these people are bad, but I'm just telling you that the clubs they form and the way they develop it gets to be pretty unhealthy. And they will turn on you on a dime. They may engage in illegal activities in order to prove themselves and prove that they're the one true party, to prove that they're the ultimate revolutionaries. And then honestly, my advice would be to stay away from these groups, because, could they lead to anything good though? Yes, I do think that there is potential down the road for people that are involved in this kind of stuff to go in a good direction. And I'll tell you how, right? Those of us who actually understand economics, right, that capitalism doesn't have room for workers at the assembly line. And, the tendency of the falling rate of profit, the problem of overproduction, value crisis, right? The socialist math video I talk about on these streams. There's going to be a lot of people outcast and starving amid the wonders we have made. There's going to be a lot of poverty created by abundance, a lot of poverty amid plenty. And as conditions deteriorate, we're going to see a different kind of politics. The reason this politics is not going anywhere is because it's not based on anything other than feelings. It's not based on a material need, right? People aren't suffering and starving enough that they join one of these groups to survive. If you go to countries where there are real communist groups that have real power, people join them because they're there, because they need to survive. These people are people that usually they're from suburban, kind of middle-class backgrounds, and they get involved in this kind of politics because it's an expression of what they feel, of their alienation, because radical leftist politics is a little bit trendy right now, because, they have they're smart enough to understand some real flaws in our society, to sympathize with the Palestinians, to oppose police brutality, things like that. They get involved in these kind of groups, but it's an intellectual thing. It's an intellectual argument. It's not out of material need, right? And that's why they're involved in it, and that's why it doesn't last. To some degree or other, it's a form of middle class adventurism. There's a movie called SLC Punk that came out in the 80s. And it's not about communists, it's about punk rock, but it's about, there's this young, kid who decides to become a punk rocker and, rebel against his parents. And he goes here and he goes there, and his friend Heroin Bob dies. And so then he goes back to law school and he becomes a lawyer. And there's a lot of movies like this. There was a movie that came out in the 90s, Anarchist Cookbook. And it was about a young man who gets involved in an anarchist group and ends up going to prison for a little while. And he does that. And then he just goes back to and has a normal life. And that's called middle-class adventurism. And a lot of this kind of politics is kind of just a middle-class adventure, right? It's that these are young people. And there's a lot of Tom Sawyer stuff. I don't know. Has anyone read the classic Mark Twain American novel, Huckleberry Finn? Well, if you haven't read it, I would recommend it. Obviously there's some offensive language in there, but it's about young people, right? And Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer are characters in it. And Tom Sawyer, one of the things that Tom Sawyer does is he's always trying to make everything into an adventure. And in, the climax of the novel Huckleberry Finn, spoiler alert, is that, their friend Jim, who is a slave, he's on a plantation and they're going to rescue him. And so Tom Sawyer invents this elaborate oath that they have to swear, and he draws a treasure map, and he does all this elaborate stuff. And then finally, when they get to the plantation, they discover that there actually is a paper and Jim is free. And he doesn't, they didn't have to do all that. But Tom Sawyer just wanted to have an adventure so bad. He invented this like crazy rescue plan with a treasure map and an oath and all of that. A lot of these groups, that's what they're doing. And I got to tell you, a lot of this, I showed you the video of them with their masks over their faces and, burning the American flag and, it is right to rebel. There's a lot of Tom Sawyerism, and these people, they love to hide their cell phones and, have their secret meeting. They all have a party name. They won't tell you what their real name is, as if the government doesn't know what their real name is already, the second they come to any protest, but they won't tell you their real name. They adopt a party name and they hide their cell phone and they have this clandestine thing. And I mean, there's a lot of Tom Sawyer, we're pretending we're ultra revolutionary, and it's kind of sad. But it is what it is. And it doesn't really serve a real political purpose. It's kind of a way that they can make themselves feel radical. They can be part of the radical scene. They can express their alienation. And then they grow out of it and then they move on with their lives. Well, do these groups have potential? I would say that some of the people in these groups do have potential because things are changing. The economy right now is getting to the point that people are struggling. And people are desperate to survive. And it's very possible that as conditions deteriorate, some organizations that exist like this, as just kind of a middle-class adventure for some kids, they will actually get involved and do some good things. When they do, though, and I'll just say this, and this might make me some enemies, when they do, they're going to have to change the way they operate. They're going to have to stop the middle fingers and having their faces covered and the F you, and all the talk about violence. And they're going to have to actually learn to care for people, and honestly, if those people, when people are struggling, when you start carrying out real operations and trying to get real things done, you need to make friends and allies. You don't need to distinguish yourself and prove how radical you are. You need to make friends and allies, people that you can carry out operations with, people that you can get things done with. And that's something that a lot of people that are just chronically online in their politics or involved in, they just kind of show up for the trendy liberal cause, want to get attention on social media or whatever. They don't understand. But when you actually are carrying out real operations, trying to make real things happen, you need to have friends, not enemies. You need people that you can work with who you may not exactly agree with. And honestly, if these people are going to build an organization that actually does have roots among the population, I would recommend that they start reading the New Testament, right? And I've said many times, if you really want to find out about a real revolutionary movement that existed, that changed the course of history and faced all kinds of persecution, and played a role in the fall of one of the biggest empires in history, and advocated a society where the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Read the New Testament, right? Read the epistles, and of the Apostle Paul, his letters to the Romans, his letters to the Corinthians. That was a revolutionary movement. And at the time that Karl Marx was first coming up, right, when he was first emerging, Nietzsche and a lot of people said Marxism is nothing but Christianity. This is just Christianity. And that honestly, if you're building a real movement where people rely on each other, people have to learn to forgive each other. People have to learn to look past each other's mistakes. People have to learn to be patient with one another. And you read the epistles, the letters that the Apostle Paul is writing to the church, right? There's the letter to the Corinthians, the letter to the Romans, right? You read that stuff. That's about how to build an organization that's facing persecution, an organization that's caring for people in need. And you read the epistles. You're reading real revolutionary literature, and they're going to have to change. They can't have an attitude of we have to fight about everything. Everything's a confrontation. You're going to have to learn to reconcile. You're going to have to learn to forgive. You're going to have to learn to work with people. And so I believe that in the context of the deterioration of our economic system, yes, some of these teen Maoist clubs could evolve. One thing I will say, and I've said many times, right, which is an example of how bankrupt these groups are, is why don't they support the Uhuru movement? Chairman O'Malley and the African People's Socialist Party is a group of black revolutionaries, socialists and Marxists. And, the U.S. government tried to throw them in prison for years just for allegedly getting money from Russia or being friendly to Russia. And in response to that, these groups didn't do anything to support them. Well, CPI, we did. We understand that sets a dangerous precedent. But these groups, they didn't do anything to support them, because they read on the internet and Russia bad, Russia's racist or imperialist or whatever. That tells you how clueless they are politically, right? It didn't occur to them that, the prosecution of the Uhuru movement was something they should take seriously. Even as much as they romanticize the Black Panthers, they're so politically clueless that, it wasn't cool and trendy to support the Uhuru movement. Somebody on the internet said they're no good, so they didn't support them. That's how clueless they are. Some of them will learn, though. And I think some of them will learn. I don't think it's our job to teach them, though. They're not going to learn from us, right? Especially not from CPI, right? I'm sure you talk to any of those people about CPI. Oh, my God, CPI bad. And, anytime I'm around one of these teenage Maoist clubs, it's kind of a countdown until they recognize me and go, oh, I heard about you, Caleb. You're bad. You're bad. Why am I bad? They can't tell me. But they know I'm bad, right? That's any communist in America. The first thing they tell you is Caleb's bad. Why is Caleb bad? I don't know. He just is. Well, that's why I don't want to work with communists anymore. I want to build a real movement among the population, a movement demanding a government of action that fights for working families. But yeah, that's who the teenage Maoists are, right? And that's the tradition that they come from. And it's just a trend that we see. And it's kind of interesting to see how it develops now that the RCP is no longer out there. And now we just have local teenage Maoist clubs. And so I just wanted to, kind of reflect on that political trend, do a little slideshow for you all. So, yeah, so I see we've got a couple questions that have come in, which is good. I will answer them. So why don't we do the roll call? Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Who's with us tonight? Tyler in Missouri. Good to see you, brother Tyler. I bet there's one of these in Missouri. I'll bet you anything. And I don't recommend getting involved. But anyway, names and locations, names and locations. Joe in Busan. Good to see you, Joe. Good to see you. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Paul in Brentwood. Good to see you, Paul. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Zane in Auckland. Good to see you, Zane. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Portland, Oregon. Jake Howarth. Good to see you, Jake. Michael in Bayonne. Good to see you, Michael. Good to see you. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Who is with us? Names and locations. Your mom house. Oh, you got me. Cameron in New Hampshire. You got to have a sense of humor if you're on YouTube. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Anybody else with us? Anybody else with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Anybody else? Anybody else? I've been wanting to do that slideshow for a long time. I've been observing that around the country, and I thought I had some inside information that, you know, some insights that somebody might find useful. Anybody else? Names and locations. Samuel from the Far East sending blessings. You're always here, Samuel. I'm glad you watch our stuff and appreciate what we do. It's good to know people are watching us around the world. People are watching us. There's a lot of people who watch these streams who don't, you know, who they call it lurking, where you don't say anything, you just kind of watch. Patch in Arizona, and that's fine too. Look, this channel is wildly popular. I did an interview. I didn't even think. I went on Pasta, you know, it was requested that I call into Pasta's show yesterday. He has a small, like, kind of morning call-in show. I called into it yesterday, and his co-host was Karen Kwiatkowski, who is a former NSA woman who is now an anti-war activist, works with Judge Napolitano. And I called into the show. I showed the clip last night, and I posted it right after the stream last night. That video is already up to 1,000 views. And I thought, I mean, the video is just me calling into Pasta's show. And I'm like, damn, like, how did that happen? Well, you know, people like what we have to say. I mean, the slideshow I did about Tulsi Gabbard a few weeks ago, that blew up. The slideshow on anti-revisionism, that's already at 1,000 views, right? And YouTube has really changed the way it operates. But, you know, I mean, the thing on the Joe Kent event I did, that got a huge amount of views. I mean, we're an organization. I mean, the channel here is growing, and, you know, we're monetized again, which is, hey, I'll take it. You know, I hope they don't change their minds too soon. I'm glad we're monetized again, but I kept going when we weren't monetized. You know, I keep doing it. And look, we offer something. The Center for Political Innovation, we offer something very, very special. You know, we have an optimistic analysis. We're building a real community dedicated to anti-imperialism. We got the 7-day program coming up. I hope you register for that. It's going to be pretty cool in Chicago in August. It's going to be great. But anyhow, so I want to give you all a last chance. I've got John's coffee that came in, and I've got an anonymous one that came in. You can be anonymous with Buy Me a Coffee, and that's fine. You know, I think there's some Rumble rants. Are there some Rumble rants? No, there's no Rumble rants. So yeah, we just got the 2 Buy Me a Coffee. So I'm going to give you all a chance to send more. If you have a question, go to buymeacoffee.com/Caleb Maupin. That's the best way to send your questions. You can also do super chats because we're monetized again. You can also do Rumble rants, but Buy Me a Coffee is the best way to send your questions. So if you want to shoot us $5 for a question, please do. Get me talking, right? I got at least another hour in me if you want, if you can keep me talking that long. You know, send me some questions. So I'm going to put on some music, give you all a chance to send some questions. I'm going to put on, this is a song called Oh Albania, right? After China and Albania had their falling out, there were some communists who supported Albania. And this is a kind of funny song by Canadian communists who supported Albania. So I'll put that on. Send some questions. Here we go.
Oh, Albania, red star that burns bright. The world's illuminated by your light. Socialism is mankind's destiny. We swear to fight till final victory. We swear to fight till final victory.
Workers and peasants of Albania, and the people's intelligentsia. The PLA makes them conscious of the task. Build socialism, the party leads the class. The chains are broken, new forces are released. Workers and peasants have seized their destiny, transforming mountains, the seacoast and the fields. Under the control the working class wields.
Oh, Albania, red star that burns bright. The world's illuminated by your light. Socialism is mankind's destiny. We swear to fight till final victory. We swear to fight till final victory.
Resisting every invasion of her land, national traitors crushed by her hand. It's socialism Albania defends. Marxist principles will guide her to the end. The mighty eagle from the battlement surveys the enemy encirclement. Life and death struggle requires vigilance. The party arms 2 million soldiers for defense.
Oh, Albania, red star star that burns bright. The world's illuminated by your light. Socialism is mankind's destiny. We swear to fight till final victory. We swear to fight till final victory.
The 7th Congress cuts through all the lies that the opportunists in a frenzy have devised. The Marxist-Leninists grow stronger every day, inspired by the glorious PLA. We must defend the socialist homeland. It's the proletarian internationalist stand, led by our Marxist-Leninist Communist Party. We'll end the rule of the bourgeoisie.
Oh, Albania, red star that burns bright. The world's illuminated by your light. Socialism is mankind's destiny. We swear to fight till final victory. We swear to fight till final victory.
Yep, that was a fun one. That was a fun one. All right, well, I'll answer a couple questions. I guess I'll answer at least first John's question, maybe the next one, and we'll put on some more music. But yeah, so John sent me an article by Trita Paris of the Quincy Institute, which I looked over. I'll put the link in the chat if you want to take a look at it. It makes an important point, and I skimmed over the article. So basically, the article is warning that the Democrats should not oppose the deal with Iran. That if the Democrats oppose this deal with Iran, we will never see peace. The Democrats should be happy that this war ended. And that is the crazy thing. Public opinion is overwhelmingly opposed to Donald Trump attacking Iran. Now the war is over. And now the anger is coming from pro-Israel people who say it's a bad deal. They're giving too much to Iran. And the Democrats who at least were pretending to kind of oppose the war are now, a lot of them, like Chuck Schumer and others, are suddenly saying, they have this slogan, Trump always chickens out, taco. And they're saying that Trump, he gave too much to Iran. He sold us out to Iran. This is really dangerous, right? But it's just like the Russiagate thing, right? When political parties are attacking presidents for not being hawkish enough, right? If Iran can get the sanctions lifted, amazing. If Iran can get all the money that they've had frozen, great. If the USA and Iran can have better economic ties, if American businesses can do business with Iran, if Iranian businesses can set up shop in America, all of that's really, really, really good, because the only future that America is going to have is with the rising new economy around the world. And, if we continue to go down with the British Empire system and just attach ourselves to London and Wall Street and NATO, the Atlanticist countries, and attack and bomb and isolate ourselves from the rising new economy, we're going to crash. The idea that as a result of this war ending, Iran may have sanctions lifted, Iran may be able to sell oil on the international markets, that's all good, right? I mean, it's awful that this war happened, in the lead up to it happening. It's awful they murdered the supreme leader. It's awful that they bombed an elementary school. But if a deal that ends this war, if that results in America and Iran not being enemies, that's a good thing, whether it comes from a Democrat or a Republican or anybody. In the article, it basically says that, yes, Trump spent his entire presidency bashing the Iran nuclear deal of Obama, but if the Democrats return the favor, we're trapped, and we never get out of the cycle of endless wars. I think that's a really, really good point. Again, I think that if this war can end on terms that are favorable to Iran, that's good for the world. It's good for America in the long term. It's not good for Wall Street. It's not good for London. It's not good for the Zionists, but it's good for Americans. It's good for American working families. I think that imperialism is the enemy of American working families. That's where I disagree with all these crazy Maoists we were talking about, right? I think that Wall Street in London is the enemy of the American people, and that to be a true American patriot means that you want to get America out of imperialism and you want to stand with the people of the world. You want to build that Bering Sea bridge to connect us with the rising new economy in the East, in Russia, right? That's what it means to be a true patriot. And we are the true patriots, the true lovers of America, because we advocate America beyond imperialism. We want a government of action that fights for working families. We want to break the power of the big monopolies, and that makes us the true patriots. And that's a message that could build a movement that could actually win. Screaming and burning the American flag and all the expletives, that's not going to build a real movement. And that's what some of these folks don't understand. But, yeah. And that, the fact that Trump, look, this looks like, Iran won this war. The USA attacked them in a completely unprovoked way, murdered their supreme leader, blew up an elementary school, just awful. Iran effectively retaliated against all the U.S. military infrastructure in the region. They closed the Strait of Hormuz. They caused enough economic problems that the West backed down. And in the process of the West backing down, it looks like they extracted some pretty big concessions, like the sanctions against Iran being lifted, like getting all their frozen money back, like the USA letting them continue their peaceful nuclear energy program, just not expanding it as long as they say what they've always said. It looks like Iran won this war. That's big. Right. And why did Iran win this war exactly? Well, fingers crossed. Let's hope it actually stays, this actually ends. But it looks like, the USA, yes, could have won this war, so to speak. The USA could have gone into the Strait of Hormuz with guns blazing, but enough Americans would have come home in body bags. Trump is wildly unpopular already. And if there were, 100 or 1,000 American GIs who got killed in the process of clearing the Strait of Hormuz, Trump would be politically toast. He's already politically toast right now. He's not in a good spot right now. He needed this to end. The inflation that we all faced, it's been devastating economically. Trump dug himself into a hole, and it looks like in order to get himself out of the hole, he had to give Iran quite a bit. And that says a lot about Iran. And that's what Tucker Carlson, in the clip that I showed earlier in my reporting, that's what Tucker Carlson was pointing out, was that Iran has demonstrated it has a lot of power and has a lot of ability to get things done. And the USA, it used to be that, the USA with the biggest military budget in the world, if the USA went to war with you, you were done. It looks like Iran faced down the United States, called America's bluff, and forced America to the table and won some pretty favorable terms. That doesn't mean that the war was a good thing. That certainly doesn't mean that that Iran hasn't suffered horrendously in this conflict. But if this leads to a chilling of relations, if this leads to things getting better, I think that's great. And we should support a peace deal, and we definitely shouldn't play into the idea this is too good for Iran. That's ridiculous. The fact that any Democrat is saying that, that's just, my goodness, right? First they were mad at Trump because he was allegedly too friendly to Russia, and now, even after he blew up Iran and killed all kinds of innocent people, killed their leader, he's not anti-Iran enough. Give me a break. I think it's a really good sign that Israel hates this deal. It's a really, really good sign. If Israel was okay with this deal, I'd be suspicious. The fact that Israel is screaming bloody murder against this deal makes me think this is actually a good deal. So there we go. So I guess I will answer this next question. It's a 3-part question, actually. So it's a 3-part question sent anonymously, but it's geopolitical questions. The first question is, what's it with the U.S. using political Islam in Chechnya, Syria, Afghanistan, Xinjiang, and even Bosnia, but opposing it in Iran and makes the Gulf state hate it so much? Well, here's the thing. Right? That's his first question. It's a 3-part question he sent. You have to understand that Iran is different religiously than all of those countries you listed. In Bosnia, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in the Uyghur regions, the Muslims that they were supporting were Wahhabis, and Iran are Shia, right? So political Islam around the world since the 1970s, really since the 1950s, but especially since the 1970s, there's been a rise in what you might call political Islam. Political Islam divides into 3 categories. The first school of political Islam started in Egypt. There was a religious movement in Egypt called the Muslim Brotherhood. And they were basically a group of Egyptian merchants, small business owners that were anti-communist, but also, very, very devoutly religious. And they were in awe of America. And they said that America is more Muslim than the Muslim world. One of their clerics visited America, and he loved how we mow our lawns in America. It was like the perfectly mowed lawns, seemed so disciplined. And he argued that the reason that the Middle East was poor was because America, even though America is not a Muslim country, we live more true to Islamic principles than the Middle East. In the Middle East, they're corrupt. They've gotten away from it. And even though they profess Islam as their religion, they don't, follow the holy law. But in America, we do. And so, it's this kind of westernized Islam. And that's the Muslim Brotherhood. And the government of Turkey, the current president of Turkey, Erdogan, comes from that kind of religious politics. It's Sunni Islam that believes in free market capitalism, that capitalism is good, and that communism is a great enemy, and that capitalism is fine as long as you believe in Islam. And they tend to have charity for poor people. They say we don't need socialism. We just need we don't need the government to provide programs. We just need people to be good Muslims and provide charity. And they feed poor people. And it started in Egypt as a religious movement. And then the CIA started funding them in the 1950s to oppose Abdel Nasser. Abdel Nasser was an Arab nationalist and a socialist. And so to oppose him, the CIA funded the Muslim Brotherhood. And so starting in the 1950s, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, they call it westernized Islam, or it's a form of westernized Sunni Islam, started spreading throughout the Middle East as a counter gang to oppose communism. And now the government of Turkey and the government of Qatar are this kind of Islam. And this is the kind of Islam that is very popular. And the Somalis in Minnesota, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, this is their form of Islam. And the Muslim Brotherhood launched uprisings against Bashar Assad in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood opposed Gaddafi, called him a brutal dictator. They tend to be on the U.S. side, not on Palestine, though. And Hamas started as the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. They eventually became their own movement. But that's one movement that has been backed by the United States. That's the first kind of wing of political Islam. And that's been backed by the United States pretty solidly. Then you have Wahhabism. And that really started to blow up in the 1970s because of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, is a major oil exporting country. And because of the OPEC boycott, and because suddenly the Middle Eastern countries, because of Baathism and all that, they started getting a lot more money for their oil in the 1970s. Saudi Arabia had a lot of money. And so Brzezinski worked with Saudi Arabia to start spreading Wahhabism all over. And that's another form of Sunni Islam. And Wahhabism, it's not westernized, it's the opposite. They want to go back to the 1400s. They want to practice Islam as it was in the caliphate. They want to restore the caliphate, right? And that they view the Saudi monarchy as legitimate because it's a monarchy, just like, the government of the Islamic Empire, the caliphate was a monarchy. And they talk about, the Wahhabis, the Salafis, they eat with 3 fingers because the Prophet Muhammad allegedly ate with 3 fingers. Things like that, right? Where they want to do exactly as the Prophet Muhammad said, go exactly back to the old system. And they are very anti-Western. They say the West is decadent, the West is corrupting and bringing evil. So that's another form of political Islam. It's called Wahhabism, and it's funded by Saudi Arabia, and it's based on the Saudi monarchy. The British basically gave the House of Saud control of the Arabian Peninsula. And the House of Saud, their cleric that they followed was Muhammad bin Wahhab, right, who had that teaching. And that is the government of Saudi Arabia. It's an absolute monarchy that still practices beheadings and, is a pretty authoritarian country. That's their interpretation of Islam. And in the 1970s, and especially in the 80s, they set up shop in India with the Deobandi schools. And they were the people that led the fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union and the Chechens. And it's largely Wahhabis that are doing this. But there's also the Muslim Brotherhood. They're involved. And all those countries you listed, right? It's the Muslim Brotherhood or it's the Wahhabis. And the Wahhabis tend to be the ones, that's like Al-Qaeda is Wahhabi, right? ISIS is Wahhabi. But you also have just the Muslim Brotherhood groups. But those groups, all those places you described, those are either Muslim Brotherhood aligned Muslims, westernized Muslims, or Wahhabis. Whereas, and what's interesting is the Wahhabis tended to be Republicans, whereas the Muslim Brotherhood tends to be Democrats. And that's kind of interesting, right? Obama really liked the Muslim Brotherhood, and he would go out of his way to diss Saudi Arabia a whole lot. And Ronald Reagan was a big fan of Saudi Arabia. The Bush family are big fans of Saudi Arabia, and they don't trust the Muslim Brotherhood. And they think the Muslim Brotherhood is subversive because it's tied to the Palestinian resistance and stuff. So there's divisions among them, right? Bush and Trump even, tends to like the Saudi monarchy. And Trump has even talked about calling the Muslim Brotherhood terrorists. The Muslim Brotherhood, on the other hand, they hate the Saudis. They think the Saudis are backward, etc. But they tend to agree. They work together to bring down the government of Syria. They work together against Gaddafi, right? These are the two wings of political Islam that are aligned with the United States. And all those countries you listed are that. And the Taliban were basically Wahhabis, right? They're not exactly. They're not exactly Wahhabis, but Osama bin Laden, who organized the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union, was a Wahhabi. And you're describing that. Now, Iran is different. Iran is Shia. Okay. And Shia Islam in Iran is a completely different political movement. And it takes on a different character. So, right. So you have, the Muslim Brotherhood, which are westernized Sunnis. You have Wahhabis that are the, traditionalist authoritarian Sunnis. And then you got Shia Islam. And Shia Islam is it's a minority current. It's been around since the time of the Prophet Muhammad, but it's been a minority that follows the imams, the successors to the Prophet Muhammad. And emphasizes martyrdom, right? And it emphasizes that if you die for the oppressed, if you stand with the oppressed, if you die for the oppressed, you're one of the most holy, you're one of the most respected, etc. It's been around, and there have been various Shia uprisings that have happened in Sudan and other places. And in 1979, a Shia cleric named Khomeini became the leader of the Islamic Revolution. And Khomeini, he was a conservative critic of the Shah, right? In Iran, you had the Shah was the U.S.-backed dictator, and you had leftists that didn't like the Shah, like the Communist Party. Mossadegh had been the elected leader. The USA overthrew him and put the monarchy, the Shah, back in power. The monarchy had been overthrown during World War II because they'd supported Hitler, and then they had Mossadegh, who was kind of a leftist president, who was elected. Then the CIA overthrew him and put the monarchy back in. And the monarchy was originally supported by Khomeini, but then Khomeini objected to the monarchy because it was not religious enough, right? And that the white revolution involved modernizations. And so Khomeini fled Iran as kind of a right-wing or a conservative critic of the Shah of Iran. But if you look at Khomeini's writings over the course of the 1970s, as the Vietnam War was happening, right? And Vietnam, many people around the world were rallying in support of Vietnam against the U.S., seeing the U.S. as the oppressor. Khomeini's rhetoric changed. And I have a bunch of Shia Muslim books that I got in Iran, and I read those books. And if you look at like the 1970s, right? The Islamic Revolution of Iran was very, very much influenced by communism. It was not communist because communism is atheist. Communism is dialectical materialism. But the Islamic Revolution of Iran was not Marxist, but it was anti-capitalist. The slogan was not capitalism, but Islam, neither East nor West, war of poverty against wealth. And on the one hand, it was culturally rejecting it. I guess it pulled from the Wahhabis, the contempt for Western culture, right? They viewed the Shah and his allies that were in the government backed by the United States. They viewed them as decadent, perverted, immoral Westerners who drank alcohol, had wild sex orgies, all of that. So it was like conservative criticism of the Shah, but at the same time, also kind of a leftist critique of that he let people starve, he let the country be plundered by big corporations, and that the Islamic Revolution of Iran, the Shia current, that Shia Islam is a very diverse thing, but in Iran, it became the expression of an anti-imperialist political movement. The other thing is that Iran is not an Arab country. The Iranians are Persians. They're not Arabs, okay? And in most of the Middle Eastern Muslim countries, they're Arabs. And so the Arab countries, you had Arab nationalism that was like Ba'athist Arab socialism or Arab socialism that was in the military, that was secular. And then you had and that tended to be the people in the government that were, the wealthy people that were tied in with the military that wanted to do contracts with the Soviet Union. They tended to support that. Where it was the merchants, the small business owners, the private sector, they were the Muslim Brotherhood people. So you had the secular Arab nationalists that were socialists, and then you had the the private sector, the wealthy business owners who didn't like the government, didn't like the military, and they were religious. That was in the Arab world. Iran is not Arab. Iran is Persian. And so you didn't have Arab nationalism in Iran, right? And in Iran, right, the Persians are the majority, largely, but you have Arabs. There are Arabs in Iran. There are Turkmen in Iran. There are Kurds in Iran. A lot of people in Iran are not Persian. And the Islamic Revolution of Iran, on the one hand, it wasn't nationalist, right? Because the Shah was a nationalist. He said, I'm for the Persians. We, the Persians, are the master race or whatever. Well, you know, the Islamic Revolution of Iran was for everybody who lived there. Racism was outlawed by the Islamic Constitution. And a lot of the leaders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, you look at their skin tone, they're a bit darker, right? Persians tend to be a little bit lighter skinned, and they're darker. Like they might be Arabs, like they might be Turkmen, like they might be Kurds. Right. And that the Islamic Revolution of Iran, in a lot of ways, was about supporting the national minorities and not being nationalist to Persians on the one hand. But on the other hand, it was very, very anti-capitalist. And it was they made a point of opposing communism also, but it's a totally different character. So the Islamic Shia current, there are times where they have collaborated with the United States, no question about it. And they were very anti-communist. And the other thing you have to remember, and I've talked about this, and this is an important thing to remember, is all of the communists in Iran discredited themselves. And I've had Iranian communists get very angry with me for saying this, but this is true. The communists of Iran largely discredited themselves. For example, during the Second World War, the Shah of Iran, right, was the king of Iran who was supporting Hitler, and the Soviet Union and Britain, the British Empire, their colonizer that had murdered millions of Iranians, they had a joint invasion of Iran to remove the Shah because he was pro-Hitler. And the communists of Iran supported the British Empire invading Iran and removing the Shah. Now, I understand why they did that. It was because it was World War II, because of Hitler. But to a lot of Iranian people that felt oppressed by the British Empire, they said, look, you're supposed to be communists. You're supposed to be fighting the imperialists. And here you're working with the British imperialists because they're supposedly democratic imperialists to invade our homeland. And a lot of Iranians didn't support the communists after that, thought the communists were discredited. And the Maoists, right? So then there were Maoist communists. There was a Maoist communist group in Iran. They're called the Fedayeen, right? The People's Fedayeen Guerrillas or whatever they were called. And they were aligned with China. Well, China supported the Shah because they said the Soviet Union was the main danger. In 1978 and 79, they opposed the Islamic Revolution. They supported the Shah because they said the Soviet Union was the main danger. So the communists of Iran had all discredited themselves. The main Communist Party had collaborated with the British in overthrowing the Shah during World War II. And also, they just kind of proved themselves to be ineffective. When Mossadegh was the leader of Iran, was overthrown by the CIA, they were really not able to actually mobilize resistance to the coup, and they were kind of manipulated by the CIA, and that's a whole other story. So the Tudeh party, which was like the Soviet-aligned party of Iran, was discredited. The Fedayeen, the Maoists, they were discredited because China took bad positions, right? And then there was a third group that was a terrorist group, the Mujahideen cult that now works for Israel and assassinates Iranian nuclear scientists. But they were the Islamo-Marxists of Iran, and they did suicide bombings, and they blew up the Iranian parliament, and they took people hostage, and they were just violent extremists. And so at this point, right, in Iran, all three of the communist parties had discredited themselves. And Khomeini, and this is something that Sam Marcy, the founder of the Workers' World Party, pointed out, which, that guy, there's a lot of criticisms you can make of him, but it's one point. Khomeini had always opposed the imperialists. He had always opposed the British Empire. There was not one instance of him collaborating with the British. There was not one instance of him collaborating with the Americans. He had the credibility. He was consistently anti-Western. He said, we need to go back to our Islamic roots. We need to create an Islamic government, and America is the great Satan, and Israel is the little Satan, and we don't want any of that Western decadence, and the Shah is a sellout and a sex pervert and a drunk who lives in splendor while people starve. And he was the guy who, whatever you want to say about Khomeini, he was consistently anti-imperialist, and that he absolutely was. And that's why he ended up winning. And there are people who claim, All right. The CIA brought Khomeini to Iran to prevent a communist revolution. That's something communists say, and I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true. But even if it was true, I mean, he worked against them. What is interesting is that it's pretty clear that in the early years of the Islamic Revolution, the British were trying to drive oil prices up, and they knew that Khomeini, that he had kind of an apocalyptic ideology. He called himself Imam, like he might be the Mahdi, the last Imam. And it wasn't originally a revolution for Iran; it was a global Islamic revolution, and the end times and the last Imam, and that there was an uprising in Saudi Arabia, there was an uprising in Pakistan, there was an uprisings all over the Middle East among Shia Islam. Many Shia Muslims thought it was the end times. It's clear that to some degree or other, the British Empire and imperialism, they appreciated the chaos that the Islamic Revolution was spreading. And they didn't like Ba'athist Arab socialism. They didn't like Arab nationalism either. And so when Iran, the reason that Iraq invaded Iran is Saddam Hussein feared because Iraq has a Shia majority. And Saddam Hussein feared the Shia Muslims of Iraq would revolt and against him, inspired by the Islamic Revolution. I mean, it made sense. And at the time, this was the strategy of Brzezinski, is that basically to oppose the Soviet Union, rather than just have the United States attack the communists and have the communists sit at the center of an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist united front, the USA kind of stepped back and then manipulate the various anti-imperialist forces against each other. Khomeini was an anti-imperialist, but he was a Shia Muslim anti-imperialist. And so it's possible the USA could have boosted him to some degree. Ba'athist Arab socialism is anti-imperialist and often was aligned with communists, but not always. And it's possible. I mean, we know the USA armed Saddam Hussein at various times. It supported him against Iran. And then later the USA supported Iran against Iraq. And that the strategy, the USA supported the communists of Pol Pot against the Vietnamese communists. At times, the USA, was friendly to China. Nixon went to China while the USA was trying to isolate the USSR. So this was the late Cold War. In the early Cold War, the USA was losing. The USA was losing because, in Korea, right? The USA, the Korean peninsula was divided. The Korean people started moving to reunify. And so the USA went in there and it bombed the hell out of North Korea and killed millions of people. Very brutal. I mean, there's a documentary called The Unknown War that Bruce Cummings made. I mean, the crimes against the Korean people that were committed by the United States are unspeakable. I mean, millions of people slaughtered. I mean, every building above 1 story tall in North Korea was destroyed. They killed millions and millions of people. And the effect that had was, a lot of people around the world sympathized with the Korean people, and a lot of people around the world and a lot of people on the Korean peninsula supported North Korea, the North Korean government. And Vietnam, the USA bombed the hell out of North Vietnam, killed millions of people. And as a result, eventually the Vietnamese were victorious. And the strategy of just kind of seeing an anti-imperialist or communist government and just attacking them and just killing millions of people, it might work in the short term, but it creates enemies, it creates resentment, it creates hate. And in the long term, it was benefiting the communists. So Brzezinski figured out that the game to play it's that counterinsurgency stuff, right? If you read Brzezinski's book, I quoted a lot in my writings about the technotronic era. It was play games, play favorites, be friendly to this anti-colonial group and attack this one, and then be friendly to this one and make a deal with this one, and that confuse the anti-imperialists against each other. And that's what happened. And in 1978, 2 communist governments, Cambodia and Vietnam, went to war with each other. And then eventually China invaded Vietnam to support Cambodia. And in the Middle East, you had the Iraq-Iran war, where a Ba'athist Arab socialist government and an Islamic Shia government went to war with each other. And on the African continent, you had fights like that, in Ethiopia, where the Maoist communists were waging war against the Soviet-aligned communists and the Derg. And that's how the USA was actually able to win the Cold War, was manipulating various anti-imperialist currents against each other. So the way you're explaining it here, like Iran is just the same as these other currents. Yes, they're Muslims, but they're a different kind of Muslim. It's a different political movement. They're not the Muslim Brotherhood. They're not Wahhabis. And, so that's it. Did Iran ever explain why they supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan as well as Bosnia and the Bosnian War? I think it's obvious. They're Muslims, right? I mean, that's pretty straightforward. They're Muslims. right? Iran, they're Muslims, right? And the Soviet government in Afghanistan, the People's Democratic Party, was secular, and the resistance against them was done in the name of Islam. And Iran made a big point. They were not a Soviet-aligned country. That's why they waited to release. That was actually, when I was in Iran, I did a sit-down interview with one of the women that had been involved in the embassy takeover. I wish I could get the video of that. It was a fascinating interview. That's why they released the hostages on the day that Reagan was inaugurated, is because the Soviets liked Jimmy Carter because of the SALT Treaty. And Iran wanted to make clear they were not a Soviet-aligned country. Iran was not Soviet-aligned. They condemned American military and economic imperialism and Soviet social imperialism. And Khomeini, very much, he dissed the Soviets many times. And, they did business with the Soviets, but they were not a Soviet-aligned country. They were kind of like, China. They wanted to take a third camp position, neither east nor west. And they were Muslims, and they viewed the Soviets as secular. They viewed the Soviets as atheistic, and they were not on the Soviet side. And in Bosnia, right, they were for the Muslim minority against the secular, Slavic, Yugoslavia government. I don't think it's that hard to understand, right? They are Islamic, right? They are Shia Muslims, and they will support Muslims, right? Their anti-imperialism is not, it's not like we will just be anti-imperialist. They are Shia Muslims. They believe in Islam, right? They believe Islam is the solution. You read the letter that Khomeini wrote to Gorbachev when the Soviet Union was falling. He said, don't dissolve the Soviet Union, just become Muslims, convert to Islam. And that they are anti-imperialist, but their anti-imperialism is based on Islam, and they side with Muslims. I don't think it's that complicated to understand. Was the U.S. ever in opposition to the Taliban? You've called the withdrawal a handover. That's a good question, right? I would say yes. The USA overthrew the Taliban because, many people have documented, and I remember before 9/11, maybe a year before 9/11, we started getting negative news stories about the Taliban in American media. They started telling us that, like, the Taliban, that they were persecuting Buddhists. Apparently, they had destroyed some ancient Buddhist statues. Apparently, they were making Hindus wear signs around their necks that said, I am a Hindu. And the Taliban, the UN said the Taliban was doing a great job getting rid of drugs, right? Wiping out the poppy fields. But U.S. media started criticizing the Taliban, and that was related to oil and gas treaties. That they were, that there was a pipeline they wanted to build through Afghanistan. They weren't going to let the pipeline go through, and that, Central Asia is a very strategic place. Eurasia, right? Look at the world island, right? And Afghanistan is right there, and north is Russia. And, and you've got China over here, and you've got Iran over here. You got three geopolitical rivals of the United States. Afghanistan's right in the center there. And Afghanistan, the government, the Taliban, which, comes out of the U.S.-backed insurgency against the People's Democratic Party, comes out of forces backed by the United States, was pretty friendly to the United States, but was, but it had that Wahhabi anti-Western, and it looked like the Taliban will do business with whoever they're kind of like Erdogan in Turkey. They're kind of like Modi in India. They're a little bit more freewheeling. They will do business with whoever they want. Look, when I went on that ship to Yemen, I spent a long time on that ship talking to the Shia Muslims from Iran, but there was a German guy on the ship with me, a guy named Christoph Herzl, who was embedded in Afghanistan. He was a German who hated the Soviet Union, and he went to Afghanistan, and he fought with the Soviets, or he fought with the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. And he was a German guy who, and I talked to him, and he said, when he was in Afghanistan, he would hear the Taliban guys, the Afghan Wahhabis. He was fighting the Soviet Union. He was embedded to fight the Soviet Union against. He would hear them, talk, and they would say, first, we're going to take down the Soviet Empire, and America is next. That's how they would talk, right? And that we hate the West, we hate America. Sure, the Americans are supporting us now, but we think they're disgusting. And, that they were quite open about it. And again, these forces all have their different views. One thing I will say, and when I told the handover, one thing that's very, very interesting, Guantanamo Bay, right? In Guantanamo Bay, you have a whole lot of, Taliban guys. You have a whole lot of, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda guys, and they haven't executed them, and they haven't put them in jail, had them stand trial. They're just sitting there in Guantanamo Bay for decades and decades. They just sit there. And, You think they haven't figured out every mind control operation, every brainwashing program, and they released a whole bunch of those guys from Guantanamo Bay. They're now in the government of the Taliban. That's crazy. And in the lead up to the USA withdrawing from Afghanistan, there were meetings that went on for months and months and months where the USA made all kinds of deals with the Taliban. And, Russia and China have to spend a lot of money. They have poured a lot of money into Afghanistan to keep the Taliban on their side. And every so often the Taliban, attacks Pakistan or so I don't think the Taliban was the USA opposing the Taliban. Yeah, the USA invaded Afghanistan and overthrew them because they were getting too friendly to Russia and China and they weren't cooperating with them in oil and gas deals. But the Taliban will do business with whoever they want. And to some degree or other, even in the final years of the US occupation of Afghanistan, it was what they would call in French terms a phony war. Walmart was sending guys over to Afghanistan to meet with the Taliban and getting them suitcases of cash and saying, if you attack US troops, don't blow up the Walmart. And it was true on the US military bases in Afghanistan. There were Walmarts, there were Walmarts on the bases, and they gave the Taliban suitcases of cash and they didn't blow up Walmart. And it was a scandal that got exposed over here. It was particularly ridiculous. And to some degree or other, it was what you might call a phony war in the final years. And I would argue the USA occupied Afghanistan to keep it unstable, right? And, Afghanistan is somewhat more stable now that the Taliban runs it. But while the USA was running Afghanistan, all kinds of different factions were fighting each other. It became a base area for drug gangs to spread drugs into Russia, to the Uyghur separatists to, have their bases of operations and go into China and try to break China away, the Uyghur sections of China away. It was a place that, groups that wanted to break the Iranian, the Islamic, the Sunni separatist groups in Iran, the Jindullah or whatever they're called, and that instability. Afghanistan was this really, really poor country, one of the poorest countries in the world. It was wildly unstable, drug gangs and terrorist groups, and they spread throughout the region. And Pakistan has had issues. And so, the USA kept Afghanistan unstable for 20 years. And then they just said, now it's Russia and China's problem. All right, we're pulling our troops out. And now Russia and China, you spend your money keeping Afghanistan stable. Well, Afghanistan's more stable than it was before, right? But yeah, that's my thinking on that. And it was kind of a handoff, and that it was also sabotaged from within. That's the other thing. And I think that there were clearly forces that didn't want the USA to leave Afghanistan. And so they made a point of screwing it up. But the military hardware that was left behind, I think that was a gift. I think that was part of the deal, is we'll give you these helicopters and stuff. No, I don't think that, it was just, Biden just hates America. Like, Biden's a communist. Don't you know? I'm Rush Limbaugh. Biden's a communist. That's why he gave Afghanistan back to the Taliban. He hates America because he's a communist and he doesn't support our police. He supports Black Lives Matter and he's a communist and he wants to destroy our freedom. Come on, right? We know. I think the hardware was probably one of the deals. When we leave, we'll give you these helicopters. If so anyway, okay. So if anyone has any more questions, right? I think I've got probably another good 40 minutes in me if people want to send any more questions. But if you all don't have any questions, I won't. So I do want to let you know, if you have any more questions, the best way to send your questions is to go to buymeacoffee.com/Caleb Maupin. You can also do super chat. Oh, there was a super chat that came in. Sorry about that. There is a super chat that came in, right? It says, do you think that communist China implements capitalism more effectively than the US does? China practices industrial capitalism, whereas the US of today seems pretty much only to practice banking, finance, debt capitalism. Well, I understand what you're saying, and what you're pointing to is true, but we have to, whenever you have these kind of conversations, we have to talk about what words mean. Okay, so when you say China implements capitalism more effectively than the US does, what is capitalism? Is capitalism, factories producing products? Well, communist countries do that. Communist governments do that. What is capitalism? Now, this is where it gets weird. My understanding of capitalism is a system of profits and command. When the economy is centered around making profits for a group of private owners, That's capitalism. I don't think China is capitalist because there are private owners who are making lots of profits, but the government can come in at any time and tell them what to do. And they have 5-year economic plans, and there is a big market sector, and there's a lot of billionaires and millionaires, but at the end of the day, the party is in command, not profits. So I don't see that as capitalism. But what you said about China, their economy is based on producing products, right? And that's you're defining that as industrial capitalism, okay. And that banking and finance and debt runs American capitalism. Well, that's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Capitalism in its monopolistic stage is the rule of finance. In the 1890s, the period of industrial capitalism came to an end, and we entered the monopolistic stage of imperialism. Lenin called it imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. It was the rule of bankers over industrialists. It was the rise of an international financial oligarchy. It was the export of capital, corporations spreading their tentacles across the planet. What you're describing in America, how we were ruled by banks, and those banks get wealthier even as they impoverish people, and we're not creating real value. Fictitious capital is dominant. That is capitalism in its monopolistic stage. And Lenin called it imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Henry Charles Carey called it the English system versus the American system. And now, there's the geopolitical school of thought that talks about the Atlanticist model versus the Eurasian model. And you're pointing to the difference between our economic system and theirs. My understanding is that what they practice in China is not capitalism because profits are not in command, because they have state-run industries, because they have 5-year plans, and because profits are not in command. It's a planned socialist economy that utilizes the market and which lots of wealth is generated. But you're calling that industrial, and I think you're pointing to a real difference. That is a real difference between our economy and theirs. Their economy is based on making products and real economic growth. Our economy is based on fictitious capital. So this is one of those situations where you and I don't disagree at all, right? We just disagree. We have a different vocabulary, but we agree. You're saying China has a real physical economy where people are getting wealthier, and I agree with you. And you're saying that America has an economy based on speculation and Wall Street getting rich while society gets poorer, and I'm agreeing with you. And I don't want to argue with you about what words mean. I want to agree with you. I agree with what you're saying there. I just define the terms differently than you. The difference between us is only semantic, but we agree. You understand how China's economy works and how our economy works and why our economy is failing and their economy is rising. And I agree. And I would like us to adopt an economic model similar to what they do in China, where the state organizes the economy and forces real growth. We have real solid economic growth. I want a pro-growth and anti-monopoly government, a government that'll break the power of the bankers and big finance and put working families first. That's what I want, and that's what China has. And if you call that industrial capitalism, fine. I mean, then I'm for that. But that's, I don't understand that as capitalism, because capitalism is the market, doing whatever it wants. Whereas if we create a national bank and have a lending the credit strategically, if we put our natural resources, our oil and gas under public ownership, if we had 5-year economic plans, if we mobilized the population to build, if we started investing in our people with public education, financed public health care that was based on prevention, I would say that having a pro-growth, anti-monopoly government, breaking us out of imperialism, and having an economy based on a government that is actively building and constructing and investing in the population and human labor power as the source of all wealth. Again, there was a time where I would have called that socialism or communism, but I've learned that any talk of socialism or communism in America just turns into a conversation about making everyone equal. And so rather than arguing with people about vocabulary, I'll tell you what I'm for. And if you go to our website, cpiusa.org, it's very clear what we're for. And what we're for is what you're describing, right? We're for a government of action that fights for working families. We're for a pro-growth system. That's what we're for. So, yeah, there you go. There you go. All right. And then we got another question. All right. Did you hear that the Spartacist League actually disavowed their previous support of Roman Polanski? Yes, I read it in their magazine. I'm a subscriber to their magazine. I ran into them at a protest and I got my subscription and I read it. It's in the magazine that they put out. So yes, I did hear it. They put a big statement on their international website. I know this is very inside baseball, but I remember you mentioned them before. Well, thank you. And yeah, they did that. And I must say, you know, I mean, I subscribed to years ago. I've subscribed to Workers' Vanguard for years because I found it very informative, especially the history articles, the articles on the Civil War, the articles on the Civil Rights Movement, the articles on the labor movement. You know, they had very long articles in their newspaper that had a lot of analysis. They also had very good articles about why China is not capitalist, why they consider China to be a deformed workers' state. They had a lot of good articles on a lot of important topics. I've resubscribed to their material, and I found it very, very disappointing. I will be honest. They sound just like, I mean, they have lost their umph, right? The Spartacist League was famous for hail the Red Army in Afghanistan, and they defended the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. They were famous for, obviously I don't like that they took that position around Roman Polanski, but, they were famous for taking, kind of hardline positions. In the 1980s, they had the Yuri Andropov Brigade after Yuri Andropov, the Soviet leader. And, they tended to, they seemed, their analysis was very in-depth, and they took kind of hardline positions. They were orthodox Trotskyists. I read their magazine now. It just seems like they seem like socialist alternative. They seem like the international Marxist tendency. They just seem like Trotskyists now. They don't seem hardline like they used to. I don't find the analysis cutting edge. I just, I'm reading it, and it's like, I when I read their analysis of the trans thing, I was just shaking my head. They didn't acknowledge any of the problems. But they did support Uhuru, and that I give them credit for. All the other communist groups didn't do anything. Freedom Road and Spartacist, Partisan Defense Committee, they did support Uhuru. So that's good. And good for them. I shook hands with them and, at the event, and good for them. So Partisan Defense Committee, Spartacist, they supported Uhuru. That I'll give them credit for. That was a hardline, consistent position. So thank goodness they did that. My picture was in Workers' Vanguard, actually. They had a photo in Workers' Vanguard out in front of the courthouse, and I'm in it, right? So I had my photo in Workers' Vanguard. I had a friend I hadn't spoken to in years texted me, "Is this you in Workers' Vanguard?" I said, "Why, yes, sir, it is," because they had a picture of the verdict outside the courthouse, but out the day of the sentencing. So, but I will say, on the trans thing, they had a special issue. It was one of the first issues of their new publication. They kind of went silent. Like they were during the COVID pandemic, they kind of stopped functioning. They kind of just went, and people thought maybe they had dissolved or something. And then, they had one leaflet opposing the lockdowns, which again, that's to their credit. They opposed the lockdowns. PSL called for longer lockdowns, and that's what I liked. They were smart enough to oppose the lockdowns. They didn't go along with the left. That's what I always liked about the Spartacist League. They didn't get on the bandwagon of the left. Unfortunately, though, I opened on the trans thing. It was just standard leftism, and they dismissed all criticism of the trans thing as just a sex panic, just a moralist panic. Well, what about women's sports? There's some points there. What about, there's some legitimate questions with the trans thing. People have the right to be trans, right? And I will, if people are adults and they want to do that to their body, that's their business. I will respect them. I will call them whatever gender they want, whatever. I'm not for discrimination, but, there are some questions there, right? And giving puberty blockers to kids that'll affect them for the rest of their life, there's some questions there. And my position has always been live and let live. I will work with people that are trans. I will work with people that have a religious objection to that. I will work with people that are LGBT. I will work with people that have a religious objection to that. I don't make those issues the dividing line. That's always been my position. But when they published their big issue about the trans, and I read it, they didn't acknowledge any of the concerns. They just made it sound like it was just like, oh, these people are a bunch of hoity-toity social conservative Christians. And it was just like, no, there's some legitimate, there's some legitimate points there that could be made. And they didn't acknowledge that. So, I saw that and I was just like, okay, so I don't know. And when I read them and I see them apologizing for some of their positions, I mean, the fact that they apologized for the Roman Polanski position, that they should have apologized for that. They should, and they also apologized for their support of NAMBLA, which is, thank goodness for that. So that, okay. I also saw them unexpelling people. They were like people that were expelled from the group. They said, we expelled so-and-so and this was wrong and they're welcome to rejoin the group. And so I don't know. Before, I remember Rachel Wolkenstein who was Mumia Abu Jamal's lawyer at one point. She was a Spartacist. She was with the Partisan Defense Committee, and they kicked her out. And I remember seeing her at events, and she was very much a supporter of Lynn Stewart when Lynn Stewart was in prison, and Ralph Pointer. And some of the people that are now supporting Uhuru also supported Lynn Stewart. And I remember I talked to Rachel Wolkenstein, and she would come to the events around Lynn Stewart with her granddaughter. And, and Rachel Wolkenstein, she very much felt she was still a Spartacist. I mean, she wasn't in the group anymore, but she had like a different position than they did on some ultra Trotskyist stuff. But, Rachel Wolkenstein, I felt like she had actually been Mumia Abu Jamal's lawyer. And I guess she had been arrested disrupting the court proceedings at one point. After she was no longer Mumia's lawyer, she went into the courtroom and made a scene at some point and got arrested or something. And that was one case. The Spartacist League supported Mumia before anybody else did. That became a very trendy cause, in the mid 80s, in the 90s especially. But they were kind of the first people to support Mumia Abu Jamal, which is interesting. Right. That was, the Mumia case. They were like one of the first groups to really talk about it. And then it really got a lot of publicity, which is interesting. Another thing that I heard, which is interesting. So John Africa, Mumia Abu Jamal is the political prisoner in Philadelphia, right? Who was accused of killing a police officer, almost got the death penalty in 1995. And his life was saved by an international effort. I mean, the French government wanted to save his life. The Pope wanted to save his life, and hundreds of thousands of people piled into Philadelphia, Amish people and Catholic nuns and priests and communists and vegetarians. And I mean, it was like all kinds of people went to Philadelphia, and that execution was stopped. That was kind of amazing. And I think many people say that was because of the Million Man March, and it was because of the LA Rebellion. The LA riots had happened a couple years before that, and the Million Man March had happened. And there was a fear on the part of the ruling class that if they did give the death penalty to this prominent Black Panther, that there would just be riots all over the country. There'd be a state of unrest. And so the U.S. government, Tom Ridge, who was the governor of Pennsylvania, had already signed Mumia's death warrant, but they backed down. They didn't execute Mumia Abu Jamal. He's in prison for the rest of his life. They're not going to let him out. I mean, it would be great if he had a new trial and they let him out or something. They're not going to, I don't think. He's going to die in prison, unfortunately. That's wrong. He should be free. He's innocent of the crime if you look at the evidence. I believe he is innocent. But regardless, I mean, and there's no question he didn't get a fair trial. I mean, even according to the prosecution's own chain of events, he shouldn't have been convicted of murder, because in Pennsylvania law, to get the death penalty for murder, it has to be premeditated. And according to their chain of events, it wasn't premeditated. I mean, it's like, it was clearly a political case. It was kind of the Fraternal Order of Police, kind of their revenge for the Black Liberation Army, for the, whatever. But Mumia Abu Jamal, he's part of a religious group called MOVE, right? That Pam Africa and Ramona Africa are members of, right? It was a religious sect in Philadelphia, the MOVE organization. The founder of the MOVE organization was a guy named John Africa. And John Africa was put on trial in the early 80s and acquitted. And he represented himself in court, and he convinced the jury to let him go. They charged him with illegal gun possession, and he was acquitted. He represented himself, but Sam Marcy, the founder of the Workers' World Party, was his legal advisor, was in the courtroom kind of giving him advice. And Sam Marcy was a lawyer. That I didn't know. And I honestly don't know why that's not in, more biographies and stuff of Sam Marcy. That's kind of fascinating. And apparently Mumia Abu Jamal, before he was, a political prisoner, he was just a journalist in Philadelphia who was part of the MOVE organization. And he apparently did know the Workers' World Party. I mean, he knew Sam Marcy, and he knew them. I didn't know that. I didn't know that for many years until I was informed of that. That's fascinating to me. And if I could find any evidence of that, I would like to document that. But I've heard that Mumia Abu Jamal was in the courtroom at John Africa's trial, and so was Sam Marcy. And Sam Marcy was there giving him legal advice, and Mumia Abu Jamal was there as a radio journalist, and they knew each other. And, that I find to be very, very interesting. And, but yeah, the Spartacists were the first group to support Mumia Abu Jamal. And for a while, his lawyer was Rachel Wolkenstein. So there you go. There you go. All right. Well, that's a fair number of questions. Okay. All right. Well, tell you what, I will give you one last chance. If anyone else has got any more questions, super chats, rumble rants, buy me a coffee. The best way to do it is go to buymeacoffee.com. If anyone wants to send any more questions, the best way to send them is go to buymeacoffee.com/Caleb Maupin. Questions are appreciated. And so I'm going to put on, one of the like CPI kind of promotional videos we did. I'm going to put that on. And after this video, if anyone has any more questions, I'll answer them. And if not, we'll end the stream. So this is a video we did about CPI.
Jumping Jackson, we're good. All right.
So I decided to go to a Chicago workshop, and Caleb explained the economics of why our country is taking us to war. It's part of the economic system of globalism, imperialism.
The thing that struck me was that he was very passionate about what he was saying. He was very passionate.
Be myself and not be judged, for who I am.
I knew about the Trotskyist to neocon pipeline, but I didn't know why that was. I thought it's kind of a mystery. What I found by learning from Caleb is that the common thread is anti-populism. It's a distrust of the vast majority of working people.
The idea of defining capital as profits in command, and that's a brilliant definition to simplify it for people.
To try to actually build a community in the United States and also caring for one another.
I remember looking over the room and I saw all of the people in that room. It was a packed room. It was almost 150 people. And there was just this energy of acceptance, of goodwill towards other people. And they could just have a good time. And I remember thinking this is for me. I could do this. I'd like to do this for my life. I want to be an anti-imperialist.
I was just looking for a real organization, an authentic organization that really wanted to had a positive message and really wanted to build up America.
Have friends who are like-minded in the sense of trying to find the answers of becoming a real anti-imperialist.
So I found it very enlightening, and I was inspired to start my own chapter of CPI up in Minneapolis.
And yes, I was pushed to be a better activist. I was pushed to be more socially oriented. But I was never made to feel like I was a bad person for being the way that I was.
The LA group, what a great team of guys. It's just been such a rewarding experience.
And I've made some great friends along the way.
I remember feeling, for the first time in a long time, like I belonged somewhere. And I was never made to feel like I was a bad person for knowing things. People were interested in talking about the things that I was interested in talking about. And I could speak freely about my opinions, and people were fascinated.
He was talking about someone who drew a picture of him, and it was very funny. It was him in a suit and tie, which is what he was wearing, I think, that day that he was streaming. And he had, in this picture, there was him in his red hair that someone had drawn, and he was supposedly yelling, and I thought that was hysterical because they really captured the passion, and I think they were trying to be funny, but he showed that picture, and I hope he shows this picture because I think it's hysterical. It's not like sort of old man yells at cloud, but it kind of has an old man yells at cloud energy. But what he was really yelling at, as I got to know him as a person and look at his streams, was that he was yelling at what this country and what imperialism is doing to the rest of the world. And he was really trying to educate people to that effect. And having that level of passion is going to bring out different sides of you that some people may understand, some people may not get. but I certainly did get it because I have the same fiery, passion as well. So in that, we are all kindred spirits at CPI, but certainly seeing Caleb that first time on YouTube, on his live stream, just going off.
Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Revolution, in one of his speeches, he said, if a person's political line is incorrect, his very soul is incorrect. Now, that's often misquoted or translated as, if a person has the incorrect political line, it is as if he has no soul. Well, I'm going to say that Mao had it backwards. I would say that it's not that if a person has the incorrect political line that he has no soul. I would say that if someone has no soul, then they have the incorrect political line. That's what I would say. And if we are not espousing optimism and hope, we have the wrong political line, no matter what we say. Yep, that's us. We're the Center for Political Innovation. You should join, and you should come to our workshop that we're doing in August. You can register for that today. We will follow up with you. I must say, just kind of on what the opening of the stream was about, these groups, they have a negative vibe, right? They have that kind of libidinal, Oedipal culture about them. And that is going to be their downfall. You can't build a sustained organization based on hate and resentment. You can't, right? China stopped doing the Cultural Revolution, and what Stalin did, the way Stalin got away from Trotskyism, you cannot build a real movement with roots among the population. You can't build with hate. You can build with love, you can build with community, you can build with optimism, and you can build with struggle, with people asserting themselves, but you can't build with hate. And that a lot of the communist groups, even though they have the communist theory really points to the reality of a lot of economics, about imperialism, about overproduction. These communist groups, a lot of them are just based on rage and hate and resentment. You can't build an organization based on that. You have to build. You can't just tear things down. You got to build, right? You got to build. And if those groups are going to ever turn into something that is decent, they're going to have to connect with other people, and they're going to have to put real roots in the community. And they're going to have to work with people they don't agree with. And they're going to have to not be rage factories and not just have an ideology of rebellion and destruction. And that's kind of what CPI is about, right? That's kind of the message I've tried to give in my various presentations, is we need an optimistic pro-growth movement. But anyway, all right, I don't see any more questions, so I guess we'll end it here. It's been fun. I'll be back probably tomorrow night. If not tomorrow night, I'll definitely be on Saturday. Saturday's a big night for this channel, but I'll probably be back tomorrow night. I don't see why I wouldn't be. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to put on the closing music, and we'll be back. I am going to cut this as a slideshow. I think it was important to talk about the teenage Maoist clubs and where their politics came from. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to put on the closing music and talk to you soon. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.